Charlton. It's March 13th, 2023. I want to welcome everyone to this special meeting of the Board of Finance. I'll call the meeting to order and ask that we please all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. To the members of the public, our meeting this evening is to consider and act upon the administration's plan relating to remediation and repair work at Penfield's Pavilion. I want to thank all the residents who've taken the time to write to our board with your views on this issue. The feedback is valued and it's considered carefully. We did get quite a few emails, and I was reminded once again about how engaged our community is and how strong our civic culture is. If, unlike me, you've lived in Fairfield all of or most of your life, you might not appreciate how unique we are in that regard, but trust me, we really are. If any residents have further comments or questions after this evening, you can write to the board at bof@fairfieldct.org. You can also reach members of the RTM who will be responsible for taking up anything on this matter that may pass tonight at rtm@fairfieldct.org. We also welcome live public comment this evening, both here at the meeting and via WebEx. If you are on WebEx and you'd like to make a statement, please drop your name in the chat box and indicate so now or at any time up to the public comment period. We ask that public comments be limited to no more than 2 minutes. Please also be aware that the public comment section of the meeting is a time for residents to make a statement relative to tonight's agenda item. It is not an interactive Q&A, and we will not be responding to questions or comments during that part of the meeting, but we will be listening and considering all of your feedback before we vote. So with that, I'll move to item 3, to hear, consider, and act upon a resolution as recommended by the Board of Selectmen entitled, "A Resolution Appropriating $10,500,000 for Costs Related to Construction, Remediation, and Addressing the Notice of Violation at Penfield Pavilion." Can I have a motion to hear this item? Mr. Testani, seconded by Mr. DeWitt. The full resolution for this item is printed in the agenda. Backup materials are posted online, and they include cost summaries related to the proposed project, as well as an analysis of the money that's been set aside by elected bodies to address fill pile and historical remediation issues generally, including Penfield, and how this proposal would affect the available balance. So we are going to kick off tonight with a presentation by the administration on the relevant background related to Penfield. Then we will get into Q&A with the board. Before we start, I know we have a number of people here. Ms. Kupchik, do you want to maybe give people an opportunity to introduce themselves and say who they are so that everyone knows when we get to questions?
So that's the first part of my presentation.
Okay. Great.
Okay.
I also, and I'll let you do that, I also want to, for the board, let the board know that we do have Becky Bunnell, who has dialed in, and she is the chair of the Flood and Erosion Control Board. So I know there were a number of questions, and she is here as well. And after this presentation, she can introduce herself. So thank you, and go ahead.
Thank you. So I have updated the presentation slightly since the March 6th Board of Selectmen meeting. It was clear to me that some residents and elected officials were not completely clear on the timeline and the facts, so we added additional information in this PowerPoint presentation. I want to say that tonight we have Tom Bremer, the town CAO, who I think you're all familiar with, Eli Gazal, our project manager and engineer, Bucky Marcilio, DPW Director, Jared Schmidt, obviously you know Jared. Jim Wendt is here, Town Planning and Zoning. And tonight we asked Greg Rauchi, the principal of Bismarck Construction, who helped prepare some of the estimates that you have before you in the backup. And he will be available to answer questions later in the meeting. So I shared this prior, so just a quick overview, where this whole thing started, the pavilion discussions back in '06. And as you can see, the long timeline of all the various discussions and so on and so forth. And then the next one, went into some more detail here because there were some, I guess, elected officials who didn't understand that we had been working on this since we got the notice of violation, were informed that a notice of violation was being instituted. So that was in June. Negotiations began in June to October of 2001 to identify the scope of the NOV with FEMA. The town engaged with professional consultants to develop conceptual options for review, and then discussions with the LEPs to determine the potential remediation plans for the Julian Fill. February 22 to May 22, we developed detailed conceptual plans to respond to the NOV. A letter was sent to FEMA outlining those options for compliance. In August of 2022, the RFQs were issued for construction manager, architect, and structural geotechnical and coastal engineers. And if you remember, I held a town hall meeting on August 31st with a whole host of presentation on the soil remediation and also Penfield. In September 2022, I sent an email to all our town boards with follow-up information that was requested at the 8/31 meeting. And we also had included quite a few attachments in that email to go along. The RFQ interviews continued with the construction manager and the A&E services. In October 2022, the CFO presented to all town boards proposal to fund remediation and the Penfield NOV. In November 2022, schematics and site plans were sent to FEMA and a letter to FEMA with questions from elected officials. Elected officials were requesting documentation in writing from FEMA before voting. And then in January 23, FEMA responds to the schematics with comments. The administration contacted Congressman Himes' office to assist with asking FEMA to come to a town hall meeting. February 10th, we had a conference call with FEMA to discuss the town hall meeting and their requirements for it, and FEMA notified the town at that time about the impending downgrade that they were going to institute on March 31st. On February 20th, we held a Zoom meeting with FEMA and the administration to update Congressman Himes and the state delegation. And on February 27th, the CRS retrograde letter was received by FEMA. So why are we here? Contaminated Julian fill from the fill pile was illegally deposited beneath the pavilion during construction, and the town is required to remove it pursuant to state and federal law. FEMA has determined the town installed horizontal grade beams at the height that was in violation of federal floodplain management regulations, and under federal law, the town is required to bring the pavilion into compliance. And as a result, the town has received notices of violation from federal and state agencies. Where are we? If the town does not approve a plan for corrective action by the end of March regarding the notice of violation at Penfield, we face a myriad of negative consequences that will impact residents and the town. What must the town do? The grade beam notice of violation from FEMA regarding the pavilion and the consent order from the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection and the Environmental Protection Agency for the contaminated soil, the Julian fill beneath the building. The FEMA NOV is fix the main building structure, excluding the locker room portion, and to bring it into compliance by lowering the elevation of the grade beams. The alternative to comply is knocking down the main building structure, which would then remove the grade beams. Deep in EPA, we have to remove all fill, contaminated fill from the fill pile under the building in accordance with the remedial action plan submitted to DEEP and the EPA. What happens if we don't comply? The town is a member of FEMA's community rating system, which awards communities that go above and beyond the minimum standards of National Floodplain Insurance Program. As a Class 8 CRS community, all flood insurance policyholders, including policies the town for town-owned buildings in the special floodplain hazard area receive a 10% flood insurance premium discount. FEMA has initiated steps to downgrade the town's CRS status, the result of which would eliminate the discount. The date to which FEMA describes as a point of no return for the downgrade is not final but could be as early as March 31st, meaning that if the town has not demonstrated significant progress toward remediating the violation, basically funding an approved plan, then notification to insurance companies would ensue, and the downgrade would ultimately take effect for new flood insurance policies written or existing policies renewed after October 1. Continued noncompliance could ultimately result in suspension from the National Flood Insurance Program, meaning that FEMA's flood insurance would not be available in the community, and the town would also be ineligible for disaster and public assistance funding. The result would also likely have a devastating impact on the real estate market, as flood insurance is a requirement for mortgages in a flood zone. And Jim Wendt can talk a little bit more about that if people have questions. Some people are under the impression this would be a year-long thing, and it's not quite as simple as that. Option 1, maintain the building, remediate and fix foundations. So the Julian fill needs to be in compliance. The estimated cost to remove the fill is about $5 million with the building in place. But there's also construction requirements. Demo and reinstall the building skirting, demo and reinstall decks and ramps, temporary support of the roof decks, temporary support of the building, dewatering, and then permanent structure support. That cost is estimated at $3.5 million. The actual NOV, the gray beams, to be in compliance, estimated cost $3 million, which is a total of 11.5. This is the option that was approved by the Board of Selectmen, and this 10.5 was minus the $1 million we put aside with our ARPA funds. Option 2, demolish the building and foundations. Those would, as I said earlier, would bring us into compliance. An estimated cost is $2 million. Removing the fill would be a $1 million less without a building in place. That's $4 million. And then, as I've said many times, having grown up in this town, I'm pretty sure people are going to want something back there. I want a concession stand. I want bathrooms. We need a shack, so we would need to do that. And then I can imagine a lot of our residents would ask for a covered deck to be reinstalled because it actually gets a lot of use. People really enjoy it, especially our seniors who maybe have trouble walking on the beach or just want to sit and enjoy Long Island Sound. That would be $2.5 million. How will we pay for it? Over the past 2 years, as you all know, we have been putting money away, and very responsibly, I might add, which has now turned into about $15 million, which is still available and could be used to fund the costs related to both the remediation efforts and the Penfield Pavilion repair. And as I mentioned earlier, the ARPA funds for $1 million. Also, bonding for construction is an option. Is there an option to recoup the funds spent in the past? Well, the town is exploring all legal remedies, and the investigation from the state's attorney is still active. FEMA confirmed on January 3rd's email that the town is not able to reclaim the $4.3 million in financial assistance under the public assistance program because those were Sandy funds that are no longer in existence. And as Attorney Baldwin talked to all of us during the 831, he went into quite a bit of detail about what avenues the town has explored regarding getting some funding back, suing people, all kinds of things. And then obviously, if something in the court cases remands people to pay the town something, then there would be that. So people say, well, why do we need the pavilion? 150 events a year, 80% of those people who rent the pavilion are our residents. weddings, fundraisers, holiday parties, bar mitzvahs, birthdays, business meetings, funerals, retirements, reunions. The concession stand is used, the changing stations, the restrooms, and in addition to that, Park and Recreation, as you know, sponsors a lot of events at the pavilion for students. There's activities, there's father-daughter dances, there's comedy nights that they put on for our community. There's a whole host of activities that happen at that pavilion that aren't necessarily a rental item, but are an amenity to our community. And I did want to mention, I know we had this question, I can't remember, at some point in this process, which feels like forever. People said, well, you know, how much are we making on the pavilion? And it's about $400,000 a year. But the Park and Recreation Commission, they're the ones that set the rates for the pavilion. They haven't looked at that since 2018. So currently, we only are charging $3,500 during peak season for our residents, and $1,000 more for non-residents. And if you look at some of the other venues, this is the largest venue we have in our town, space-wise. But if you look at other venues outside of our town, that's a pretty competitive rate. So it's something that potentially, if it goes through the town bodies, that the Park and Rec Commission could look at. And then we got a lot of questions from residents, for the record. My administration met quite a bit with the Flood and Erosion Board members. They came in, had a lot of conversations. They met a lot with our engineering department. So resiliency at the Penfield Pavilion is a separate issue from resolving the NOV. The town is committed to funding and hiring a coastal engineering firm to update the previous resiliency studies that are extensive. Once those preliminary designs have been established, the town will review those designs with DEEP, EPA, and FEMA, and any acceptable designs will then need to be discussed with the public. And as of course, we couldn't really do anything without their approvals. What about the elevation? To resolve the NOV, the natural grade must be restored to an elevation of 8 feet per the National Flood Insurance and Program guidelines. DEEP and FEMA have jurisdiction over the elevation at the beach. You know, so a lot of discussion is about, well, if we knock the building down, could it stay at the natural grade? Could it stay at the grade that it's at? Well, I think it's obvious we have to remove 5 to 6 feet of soil, so because it's contaminated. I'm not a scientist, but I'm pretty sure, and I've been told by our engineers that DEEP and FEMA will be very interested in how and what we do after the contaminated soil is removed. So it's not as if we can just come down there with DPW and start putting sand on the beach. That's not something we can do. Everything is highly regulated in this area for obvious reasons. Can the federal delegation help us? So on February 10th, 2023, FEMA notified the town, like I said earlier, for the first time. When I first came into office, I had a meeting with Congressman Himes. He was nice enough to come in and meet with me, and we talked about a whole host of issues, talking about the fill pile scandal. At the time, we did not know about the NOV because there was an appeal, a second appeal by the town, by the prior administration, pending with FEMA. So it wasn't something my administration was thinking about because we were under appeal, and by all rights, we thought it was a valid appeal. So we were focused primarily on the fill pile at that time, and we had asked, you know, is there any money, is there any help that we could potentially get from the federal government? And but in this instance, when the NOV came in June, obviously we have to manage this on our own and work with the federal agency. It wasn't until we had asked for a town hall meeting that FEMA was reluctant that I asked the congressman to assist us with that, because obviously I knew elected officials had told me back in the fall that they wouldn't be ready to vote on any item without a town hall meeting with FEMA and information, which makes sense. People want to have information. And like I said to FEMA many times, you know, people are not listening to me. I am not FEMA. I am telling people what FEMA says, but as we know, people like to hear it from the horse's mouth. So I thought that that was helpful, that they were able to finally come and have that meeting. And then next steps. Repair and remediation of the pavilion. Option 1, again, passed the Board of Selectmen on March 6th, and the RTM is due to take the item up on Monday, March 27th. And I will hand it back to you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you. All right, does anybody have any overall questions on the presentation before we get into other details? No? Okay, I just do have a quick one, and because this bothered me, and I saw some people wrote letters to the editors, et cetera. Who was it that, you mentioned a couple times that elected officials said they would not vote without additional documentation or without a town hall from FEMA? Can you explain that? I know that we had talked about it. We had preliminarily set up a meeting for November 22nd, a special meeting. So I just want some clarification on that. Who was it that said they would not vote without more information?
So we were getting, well, you and I discussed it. You said you wanted to have more information to me on the phone, that the information that we provided was not enough.
No.
You got a significant amount of emails from Selectwoman Lefkowitz and Ms. Zesma coming in, and I mean hundreds of questions, and other RTM members as well, saying they needed more information. We needed to provide more information. Mr. Bremer sent a whole host of documents back and forth. I think they even had to set up another server to actually upload the amount of FEMA documents that we have. There was a lot of speculation that we were sort of just like, winging it here, that we hadn't really done our due diligence with the federal regulating agency to bring a proposal forward that was vetted. In addition to that, we hadn't had a complete sign-off on our proposed plan by FEMA until January. So I have emails going back and forth from FEMA and my administration asking, when are you going to sign off? We're getting late here. We need more information. But elected officials wanted more information. I have a lot of emails to show.
And the only thing I want to clarify for the record, as far as this board goes, that I did agree, and I notified this entire board that we were going to have a special meeting on November 22nd, 6:30, prior to our quarterly meeting. So we did agree to do that. So I just I'm not comfortable leaving a statement out there that we somehow delayed this, at least this board. We did agree to do that. Obviously, we wanted, to provide questions in advance so the meeting would go well, but I don't think, as far as I know, no one on this board said they would not vote without more information in advance. So I just wanted to be clear on that.
And just for the record, we have 3 boards, and it can't come to the Board of Finance without.
Understand. I just wanted to make that clear for the record, because I saw some other information floating around, and I did actually go back and look at all my communications to refresh my memory. So, Mr. Mottola, you have a question? Okay. The only other quick question I have here is on the, and we can even get to this later, but you said the town is committed to funding the hiring of a coastal engineer to update previous resiliency studies. What does that mean, committed? I mean, we have not appropriated money for that. Are we going to be asked to do that, or what does that commitment mean?
So we included $100,000 in this overall plan.
That we're
built in.
voting on tonight?
Correct. It's $100,000 to go toward resiliency,
Okay.
to update the studies, to review the past studies. There's been a ton of resiliency studies on our floodplain areas by race, by all these organizations.
Got it. So is that part of this detailed proposal?
I believe it. I don't know where it's included exactly.
Okay, so we can go through that when we go through the details. Mr. Mottola, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. On the Penfield NOV timeline 2021-2023 slide that you had up there, and maybe I missed this, October 2022, CFO presents all town boards with proposal to fund remediation and Penfield NOV. What exactly was that, or is that? Remind me, maybe I just forgot.
I'll take you back a little further. On August 31st, when we did the joint presentation, we included a framework for how all the activities related to Penfield, remediation, construction, the NOV, how those could be funded through the existing funds that we had, the surplus, and not too much unlike what we're proposing tonight. And then in follow-up to that, during each of the subsequent board meetings during October, that was included in the backup, and I presented to each of the boards to, just to demonstrate that the funding was there.
Gotcha. Okay.
At least, to a certain extent, to fund the remediation, the construction, the NOV, and then beyond that there may need to be some additional funding to be determined for the fill pile itself.
Okay. I see it right here. Thank you for clarifying that. Can I just ask one more question while Brenda's up there? So during the last several weeks, we've been getting a ton of emails about why do we need Penfield? We have other facilities in town that we may be able to use to have events, and one of those facilities is the Burr Mansion. Are we not using the Burr Mansion anymore to have events?
We are using it. So as you remember, the History Center was kind of like in charge of it. And then I think they kind of were overwhelmed, and Mike Geely wanted to get out of the wedding business, so to speak. I think it was because the neighbors were complaining so incredibly, because they had to kind of bump up the amount of events to make up for their COVID events that they had missed. So there was a lot of events, and there was a lot of people upset in the neighborhood. The emails were a lot. Anyway, we did take it over. We have, I can't remember how many events. I have it in my email. We just updated the Google Doc. You had asked that question in there. I had given Frank some information. So we have events on the calendar at Burr. First of all, it's nowhere near the size as Penfield. The tent has to go up and all of that. We were kind of thinking we weren't sure we wanted to do with it when we took it over from the History Center. After COVID hit, I had spoke to this board quite a bit about the status of the old town hall, the condition it's in, the fact that it's just really in poor shape. I had talked about over the last couple of years with the board about all our boards about potentially adding on to Independence Hall, so all of our services could be at one location, which is approximately about a $9 million price tag. And so we started moving some decks around, some of the money that was approved in the past, to move our sort of departments and make them more efficient, give them more room. And we were thinking, in some of our staff meetings, well, maybe we should take over that building, because apparently it used to be used back when John Sullivan was here. That was used as a town-owned building, Burr, for municipal government services. I thought maybe we could put economic development in there. It'd be a nicer space for when they, have businesses come in and meet with them. It'd be something a little nicer. Maybe we could kind of break it up, and we could have economic development there and still do some events with the tent. But we haven't really gotten there yet, because we haven't had a minute for a free time, because we have so many other things happening, most notably Phil Pyle and Penfield. But those are some of the thoughts we had going forward with Burr. But there are events scheduled there, but we're just not sure where we're going.
So I know Parks and Rec took over operating the facility.
Yes.
So I understand your answer. You're saying there are going to be events there this spring and summer with the tent in the back?
Yeah, we have. I'm going to open it up. Sorry, Anthony sent this to me today. So we have 24 events, 15 are confirmed for 2023. And then we also included, John, in that Google Doc, you had asked about money that we had gotten from Burr that we plugged in there. A lot of that was state money. Actually, I had worked on with the state delegation back at the time. There was almost $500,000 in steep grant.
Okay.
I think the town itself put in over the, before I was here, somewhere, I don't know, was it like 300,000 in various upgrades to the building?
All right, and we'll get to this when we get to the budget. I don't want to prolong this, but I think the budget, the proposed budget reflects 0 for operation of the
For
Burr
Penfield.
Mansion. Well, I think for Burr too, so,
Oh, because Anthony wrote to me today, they're projecting, so 22, he said, the revenue was 144,896 for 34 offense. Expenses were 56.5, and we netted 88,392. For 23, the revenues expected is 118 for 24 events, only 15 confirmed, and the expense 84,000 because costs are up considerably. We would net about 34,000.
all right. When we get in, I don't know what night it is, maybe even it's tomorrow night, we'll talk about that more detail. I don't want to prolong the discussion about that right now, but thank you for your answer.
Thank you, Mr. Mottola. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Mr. Walsh?
Yeah, just, I was wondering whether tonight, because I watched the Board of Selectmen meeting, and they took questions before we actually deliberated. And I was wondering whether we would think that that would be a good idea. I think it would, because I'd like to hear what people have to say before deliberating and before deciding. So I was wondering whether we could start there. This way, if this conversation goes on for hours, we don't have to keep everybody sitting here waiting, and they can get on with their evenings.
Okay, yeah. I wanted to, before we go on, I know Ms. Bunnell is here from the Flood and Erosion Control Board, and she was gracious enough to join in case anyone has any questions, even though I believe she's on vacation with her family. I don't think she has the whole evening, so I don't want to, actually, maybe I'll, Becky, are you on?
Yes, hi, can you hear me? I actually just joined the WebEx as well.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. So I don't know how much time you have, and if you have time to still stay with us if we do public comment first. Are you limited, or do you, can you be here?
I can be here for a while. I do have a commitment with my family that I had wanted to do.
Okay.
I've got about half an hour to 45 minutes that I can still stay on.
Okay, no, all right, then I think we'll keep public comment at the end. But thank you for coming in case people have any questions. And before we move on, maybe just, can you take maybe 30 seconds to, for people who may not understand what the Flood and Erosion Control Board is and what the role is in the town, maybe for the public? Can you just do a quick briefer on that?
Yeah, so the Flood and Erosion Control Board, I'm just going to read this off of the town website. We plan, construct, reconstruct, and manage the town's flood and erosion control system, which include dikes, berms, dams, piping, jetties, seawalls, embankments, tide gates, revetments, water storage areas, ditches, drains, and any other structure or facilities that prevent damage from flood or erosion caused by seawater or fresh water. So really what that really means in reality is that we work very, very closely with the engineering department of the town. And we have a master plan that looks at mitigating flooding risks across all of the coastal areas, as well as we've now added riverine flooding and downtown flooding to our master plan.
Okay.
So that's the short answer. Happy to answer any questions.
Madam Chairwoman, is this public comment, or I don't know, or is this
No,
some official
no,
position?
she's invited just as
Okay.
the other guests
Okay.
are here. So there were a lot of questions.
Okay.
There were questions, comments at the Board of Selectmen meeting. We've also had a lot of public feedback. So Becky's here as a representative to help answer questions to the extent there are any. So
Okay, and all of her positions will be the official position of the Flood and Erosion Board, correct?
they might be, or she could tell us if they're not.
I think she better differentiate the two. 'cause
Absolutely.
She can't speak for the entire board.
Agreed. Unless it's something that the board has voted on. Okay, so with that, why don't we dive in? And So one suggestion here, I did watch the Board of Selectmen meeting, and the conversation was going back and forth in a number of directions throughout the meeting on costs, on flood risk, on zoning, on a bunch of things. And so I want to make sure we can get everybody's questions in, but maybe what we can do to start this, if it's okay with the board, is try to cover these topics in some kind of order. And we do have backup, which is the actual cost estimate for the project, which I think is probably the most critical thing for this board. And the estimate that we have in front of us was Bismarck Construction Company helped prepare it, and we do have a representative here from Bismarck to answer questions. So if it's okay with everyone, I think it might be helpful to start with that document, since that's the backup for the actual costs here. And then to the extent there are questions, maybe we could do it in such a way that we have follow-up questions, to anyone's questions as we go through, rather than sort of changing topics. Would that be okay? Yeah, and I mean, to the extent, yeah, and since Becky's time is limited, if there are any questions directed to her, we can do that as well. Mr. Curley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Madam Selectwoman, for the presentation. This topic has a lot of legs to it. I spent a lot of time trying to get my arms around the issues and found that I had 4 or 5 different categories of questions, and I'll probably bounce around as the board will. But I'll start with FEMA-related questions and flood and erosion control-related questions. Really, Becky, regarding the beach elevations, if I understood the presentation correctly and all the backup materials, if we proceed with remediating and fixing the building, saving the building, option 1 as it was presented, my understanding is that the beach elevation would need to be lowered by roughly 3 feet to grade, natural grade. Is that correct? And Becky?
My understanding from the way that the FEMA wrote the notice of violation is that the grade beams themselves must be reduced to the 8 feet level. The grade of the beach itself, per the LiDAR studies, was actually between 8 and 9 feet. So presumably we would be able to keep the contours around the outside of the building at the current elevations, some of which are 9 feet, but underneath the building, the grade beams would have to go to 8 feet, is my understanding.
And 2, which I can pose later, but if we did proceed with option 2, which would put a new building in place for those new amenities, the concessions or otherwise, I imagine that would have to be brought up to current code. That also would require the beach to be at the natural grade, correct?
That is my understanding of FEMA's request to the town. But that's, again, their specific call out in the appeals was 8 to 9 feet. And it would be the contours that were shown to FEMA as part of the appeal process, which included 8 to 9 feet in that area, is my understanding.
And my understanding is that the beach grade currently is roughly 11 feet. Is the expectation that the beach itself would have to come down a couple of feet?
Underneath the building, is my understanding, we would have to bring it down. But again, I do believe, again, my understanding, and this has not been confirmed through a direct conversation with FEMA, is that FEMA's request was to have the grade be 8 to 9 feet. So we would keep the contours that were in place surrounding the building at the time of the appeals and the documentation we provided as part of the appeals.
Okay, thank you.
And this is, just to be clear, this is my understanding personally, after having reviewed the documents. We have briefly discussed this in Flood and Erosion Control Board meetings multiple times, but we have not come to any board consensus on this. So I do want to be clear what I'm representing today.
Okay, I just have my colleagues to make sure they have time
Can I
to ask
follow up on
questions as
that
well.
question, Mr. Curley?
Sure.
How do you know that you said that it's your understanding that it's 11 feet? What do you base that on?
From the town hall, from the other information that was provided at all the meetings.
So on maps or something? Or, well, I'm just
It
trying to
was,
figure out
that
where
11 feet
came
was
from.
discussed in the town hall meeting. If you attended
Okay.
or listened, you would have heard that. I'll just try and wrap this up. I was glad to hear, First Selectwoman, that there was funding contemplated for renewal of the flood study, $100,000. That's good. I think that's important. Ms. Bennell, do you know the date of the last resiliency study that was done?
So the study that I think we would start with as using that $100,000 is actually 2016 study done by Race Engineering. And they had actually done, as part of the Penfield project, I believe it was around 6 different options to increase the resiliency at the Penfield site. So we had asked the First Selectman woman for funds in a November meeting. The Flood and Erosion Control Board group had, and she had graciously said that she would support that with $100,000. So we would expect that we would take that 2016 study, eliminate some of the ones that we do not think would get permitted in today's environment, and ask Race to develop alternates for us. And then we would want to take that to a meeting with FEMA and DEEP and see which ones they would be willing to permit for us. And then we would want to go back and finish the study by doing costing so that we could bring back to the boards and town residents which ones could be permitted, and also what it would roughly cost the town to execute and implement those studies that could be permitted.
$1,000 sufficient for all that activity?
It depends how much how detailed the costing is. We had discussed getting something to about 60% costing. It certainly is not enough to get to a full documented permitting costs for the options, but I do think it would give us enough of a ballpark to make fairly informed decisions if we decided to move forward with one of those.
And how long would that process take?
That's a very good question. I would ask that this become a priority for Race. I know Race is doing several other projects for us at this time. And so I would hope that they could make this a priority and do it within probably a 6-month period. It would really depend on, they would need several months to develop the alternate plans. We would need time to get a meeting with FEMA and DEEP, and then they would need time to determine what at least the 60% costing level is. So 6 months might be kind of short, but I would hope it wouldn't be more than a year. So let's say 6 months to a year would be what I would ask that they would work to accelerated development timetable.
Thank you, Ms. Bennell. I have no further questions for Becky if you want to turn it over.
Thank you. Mr. DeWitt?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And in regards to Mr. Curley's line of questioning, one, you mentioned option 2. Let me just be clear. We're not talking about option 2 tonight. Option 2, even though you presented it, did not come forward, right? So option 1 is the only thing we're talking about tonight. So I want to be clear for the public who's listening, because it was in the presentation, came up. And Ms. Bennell, if I may, through Chair, is the Flood and Erosion Control Board against this concept? Are you taking a stand against the option 1 that's on the table right now?
No, the Flood and Erosion Control Board has discussed both option 1 and option 2, and the board itself did not take a stand one way or the other. There are members of the board who support option 1, and there, frankly, were members of the board who supported option 2. Where we really have focused our energies is on the resilience part of this project. It's not, to be perfectly honest, it's really not within our remit to make a informed board decision on which of the 2 options to go with, because the building itself is not a flood control structure. It's within our remit to make sure that there are additional resiliency funds put into this project so that we can, mitigate the risk that we're going to see with this lowered elevation.
Okay. And does the Flood and Erosion Control Board have jurisdiction over FEMA?
No.
No.
We don't have jurisdiction over
No, you don't. So I don't understand why we're having this discussion here tonight. fiscal board, $11.5 million proposals before us, $100,000 for your resiliency study. I'm at a loss as to why we're having this conversation tonight. So,
Mr. Mottola?
Yeah, thank you. Well, a couple reasons. We've gotten a ton of emails about flooding if this project goes forward, and I just think we're doing our due diligence to make sure that if we have concerns about that, that we ask the appropriate questions to hopefully alleviate some of those concerns. That's all. So, well, I don't know what FEMA's going to cover, so.
that's why I said, does the Flood and Erosion Control Board have jurisdiction over FEMA? Because
I get it. I
Yeah.
get what you're saying.
Yeah.
I just think many of us want to ask some questions to alleviate some of the concern that the public has, that's all. And so, so Becky, I just want to understand what you said a few minutes ago. You have a resiliency study done in 2016. It sounds like you believe it's a good study. It gave 6 different options around the Penfield area, and you believe that $100,000 can be used to take a look at that 2016 study and ask, you call them RACE? What is RACE? Is that the company that does the work?
That's the name of the company that did the 2016
All right.
study, correct?
You want them to look at the 2016 study and develop alternatives that you may be able to employ to have some resiliency around. Is that correct?
That is correct. They are also, I believe, the town has retained them to do a coastal engineering study in addition to this flood mitigation study. So we would want to talk with them about both of those studies.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Walsh?
Hello, Ms. Bunnell. Thank you for being here this evening. I have a question. So regardless of what happens with the elevations at Penfield, whether it stays the same or gets reduced to 8 feet, the elevation at the house right next door, if you're standing on Fairfield Beach Road, the elevation at the house directly next door, which is a fairly new house, isn't that 8 feet?
That's correct. When we look at the beach as a totality, we have to look at the full coastline. And there are several places along the coast where we have an elevation of 8 feet. The way we are approaching as a board, looking at coastal resiliency, is we're looking at trying to mitigate each of those areas where there is a low section, if you will, with some sort of flood mitigation effort. So whether it is looking and working towards some sort of dune type of thing, or creating a wall, or something that would be allowed to be permitted, we would be looking to decrease the risk of flooding harm to the residents in the coastal floodplain. So yes, there are several sections right now that are at the 8 feet level. That's absolutely true. And we have a plan in place that looks at mitigating the flood risk of each of those sections that is that level of like 8 feet or so. We would want to get things up to where sort of more like a Jennings level, where you're looking at more like.
So for the
Ideally,
board,
a certain-
just for this discussion, we map for everyone. He thought it might be helpful. If you look at the arrows, the blue arrows along our whole coastline, those are all the areas that are at 8 feet along our coastline. The arrowed ones.
Right, and some of those studies, some of those arrows, we already have funds allocated to look at mitigation efforts for. Others we do not.
So Ms. Bunnell, the area that's I'm looking at a map. It's kind of large when it's seen on the wall, but with the area that it covers, it seems like it covers 5 miles. So the area at Fairfield Beach Club, it seems to be an arrow, and that to me seems like a pretty wide swath that's wide open at 8 feet, correct?
Yeah, so we actually have, the town has already authorized a $100,000 study to look at flood mitigation efforts in front of the Fairfield Beach Club. That's currently on hold while we work to get a meeting together with the Fairfield Beach Club, but
Okay.
that is one of the areas that we are looking at, increasing resiliency.
Okay, so basically, whether we change the elevation of the Penfield Pavilion and lowered it to what the FEMA legal requirements are, if a storm came in the next 6 months and it was over 8 feet above sea level, there's going to be a lot of water on Fairfield Beach Road, correct? From all sorts of spots. Correct?
If 8 feet on Nav D88, correct, but yes, you will get a overwash into the area behind it
Okay.
within the next 6 months. I think the question, I think, if I can answer what I think you're asking, is the Flood and Erosion Control Board's remit to the town is to develop a long-term plan to mitigate each of those areas that has the 8 feet, right now, a current 8 feet elevation. We don't expect that it's going to happen within the next 6 months. We expect this to be a long-term plan that over time, we will be working with the town to allocate funds to fix each of those sections to add greater resiliency to our town.
Okay, so even if we approve this matter tonight, as is, and we reduce it to 8 feet, you're still going to be working with the town, correct? It's just one of those, what looks like 15 arrows on here to mitigate,
Yes, and now
to mitigate
what
flooding.
we're doing now is we're just making one of those arrow areas worse. Because it is the Flood and Erosion Control Board's belief that lowering the grade down to the 8 feet will increase the risk of flooding to the neighborhoods behind. So we've just taken one of those blue arrows and made the issue and the flooding risk worse.
And followed the law.
I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, I'm just saying.
And followed the law and allowed our residents to still get flood insurance, which there is a risk here that we would have no flood insurance, that our 1,800 people, if we do not follow the law, will have no flood insurance at all, which would make those 1,800 residents who have mortgages be in default of their mortgages and subject to foreclosure.
That is not true.
That is 100% true. You are not a lawyer, you don't know. I've signed the documents at my own house. There is a requirement that I have to maintain flood insurance.
I have the same documents. I'm
Yep.
just saying, voting on this plan tonight, or not voting on this plan tonight, does not cause people to lose their flood insurance or their mortgages. There is a consequence, but I want to be really careful about not, there are multiple stages, there is retrograde, we lose, people may lose a flood discount. If then we do absolutely nothing, we'd go into probation and suspension. We've been through this. So I'm not disputing that if we do nothing ever, that couldn't happen. But I just want to be careful about not overstating this project, because there are other alternatives, and I'm not trying to say that this isn't a good plan. I just want to be careful.
No, and I want to be
about
careful
that.
too,
Yeah.
because people are complaining that people didn't tell people on time about stuff, and that this retrograde snuck up on people.
Mm-hmm.
The people that have been talking to FEMA is the administration. Is one of the risks that the town of Fairfield residents, the 1,800 people that are in flood zones, is one of the risks that the 1,800 residents could lose flood insurance, all flood insurance?
Mr. Went?
Jim Went, I apologize. I'm kind of behind some of you. We're kind of in tight quarters here. Yeah, I think I agree with the timeline or the chain of events that would flow as the chair has outlined them. Yes, if the town does not resolve the violation, that could be an ultimate consequence, but not an immediate consequence. The first step would be the CRS retrograde, which they've already put us on notice for. The next step would be probation, which would be a $50 surcharge in addition to losing that, and then ultimately suspension. How long a time period would elapse between suspension or probation and suspension, I don't know the answer to that, but failure to cure the violation could ultimately result in that, yes.
Great. And Mr. Wendt, did you know the timeline that we would be subject to a retrograde on March 31st in advance?
Not before it was, the ultimate, FEMA has been for a very long time saying that we're going to hold off on penalties until the appeals are resolved. And it wasn't until that February letter that announced the date by which they were going to start that process.
The February 2023 letter, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So at some point in the future, we could be given 6 weeks to be told that these 1,800 people could be in default because we still haven't fixed the problem.
Well, Jim, could you, the way you described it during the Board of Selectmen meeting and the way you described it to me prior to that, was that the process is more complicated than just 1,800 people. So if we're downgraded and then we move into this like period of time where we're supposed to try to get back to it, which Jim described as a long period of time, like not right away, it's like a year. But then he was describing the process, and Melissa Surratt explained it to me in internal meetings about FEMA coming to the town of Fairfield, going through all of our building permits, our zoning permits, and then starting to go out into the floodplain area and inspect properties. I have no idea what they're going to find in some of our residents' properties, but I just view this whole thing as a giant can of worms that I don't think anybody wants to be subjected to. And Jim said it could take up to 3 years for us to get it back. So yes, some people are citing that 1,800 people will lose a discount on their insurance. Mr. Wentz explained to me that it could impact people's ability to sell their houses if they can't get flood insurance at all during this retrograde suspension 3 years. But what also concerns me is this whole in-depth review of our community, which could put us, who knows, in many years of retrograde, because who knows what other properties are going to come sprouting out of this investigative review by FEMA.
Yeah, you did. There's two separate paths. So I think the issue of how FEMA is going to mete out the steps in the process that could ultimately suspension, what Brenda was outlining is if we are faced with the CRS retrograde, the timetable to reapply and to get back into CRS is not just a one-year deal. It's probably more like depending on the violation has to be cured, and then we can go through that process. So it is likely, because of the duration of the fix, likely to be at least a 2-year process, potentially more. So that's a different timeline. I don't know what the timeline would be, Mr. Walsh, in terms of how much notice we would get that they're moving from retrograde to probation, and then potentially from probation to suspension. I don't know the answer, what that timeline would be.
And thank you for that. I just want to get us back on track here and, really, and maybe I'll respond to Mr. DeWitt's question from earlier, because I think it's an important one. And the reason I think that there's concern about this issue, clearly the residents have concerns about their flood discount or their flood policy or their homes flooding. The way I see it is that what we heard is that there are a lot of areas, and we can see all the arrows up there, where we have, call it what you will, holes, low elevation. This project takes one area and it makes it worse. Understanding that we have to do we have to fix it. No one's disputing that. But that's a consequence of this project, and it's an unknown cost. And so that's why I think people are asking about it, because there's an issue that arises, or an issue that gets worse as a result of doing this. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It's a question of understanding that that's part of it, and there's a cost associated with it. And I think that's the question. No one is sitting here, as far as I know, advocating that we defy FEMA forever and that we send our town into this spiral at all, as far as I know. I think it's a question of understanding the financial implications, potentially, that are added to this cost as a result of putting another area of the beach at a lower elevation. That's what I would say. Ms. LeClaire, you have a comment?
Yes, because I want to make sure that we're all on the same page and I'm properly understanding this. All that FEMA is asking us to do is to restore the natural grade of the property. They're asking us to bring it to what it was pre-2012, before the storm. So it's not that, this is where the property was all along. So it's not that we're making it worse, we're just bringing it to where it originally was.
Right, which is lower than it is today. Mr. Curley? Yeah.
Yep, and that's an important point. Thank you, Mary, for that point. I do find it curious that FEMA is asking the town to lower to natural grade when and I understand that we have 17 different arrows up there and we're going to make one worse or add an 18th. But I guess this is a question back to Ms. Bennell. And I know you cannot speak for FEMA, but do you have can you provide any insight personally as to what motivation FEMA may have for wanting us to lower the grade here when it would seem that a lot of these other measures to close these low areas and prevent flooding to the neighborhood would be to increase height, not decrease?
I can give you my understanding of what FEMA is open to. I think they're really asking us to reduce the grade beam to the 8-foot level because that's what they believe the natural grade should be. And therefore the natural grade under the building would be at that roughly 8, call it 8 to 9, but 8 feet level. I think what I heard FEMA say was that they are very open to us coming back to them with additional resilience efforts, and they would review those as a way to protect the neighborhood behind. So my sense is they are very open to us coming back with what I think would be the results of this study that we talked about earlier.
And I thank you. And I guess I'll turn that back to you, Mr. Wendt. Is your understanding that the beach would have to be lowered to that 8 or 9, not just the building area, but the beach itself?
I concur with what Becky's response was. It's the area beneath the building that we're talking about, which was FEMA, it was essentially the elevation that was below the building when it was rebuilt between 2007 and 2010, and it was elevated as part of the recent reconstruction. They're asking us to bring that back to where it was before. I don't take that to mean the entirety of the beach, east and west of the pavilion, but the land beneath the building itself.
And the reason I asked for that clarification is because I think we've all received nearly 100 emails on this topic. There is a lot of concern that the FEMA and the federal government is asking us to lower the beach itself, and which would create more of a flood risk, understanding that we have lots of other holes to worry about, but I do think that that's a perception out there. So I think to the extent that there's clarification, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Curley. Mr. DeWitt?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on Mr. Curley's point. This is not getting worse, right? Much to Ms. LeClaire's point. And the Flood and Erosion Control Board couldn't even come to a unanimous decision that this is a bad thing. So again, back to my point, FEMA's good with this. I don't know why we're spending a lot of time on this. We've got to talk about 11.
Because our board members have questions, so respectfully, I want to make sure everybody gets their questions answered because it's an important issue to people, and I mean that with all due respect. Okay, can I just ask Ms. Bunnell one quick question just to clarify? So this $100,000 for a study, is that $100,000 just to cover or just to study the impact on this area of the beach, Penfield, or is that broader than Penfield?
No, that would be just for this area.
Okay, because you did mention there were other studies and other money approved to cover some of these other blue arrows we're all looking at, but this additional money would be to study the risks that are created of Penfield as a consequence of lowering the beach to address this NOV. Okay.
That is correct. And in addition, just to be clear, the Flood and Erosion Control Board as a total board did request that not only would we get this $100,000 for the study, we also requested as a board, approved as a board, that we put the design and construction costs of whatever the results of the study into the F24 capital budget, because we believe that we should actually also fund the implementation, not just the study itself.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions on this topic? Ms. Marmion?
Thank you. You partially answered my question just then in terms of the study and getting to the costs of whatever the study comes out with. You're going to have the various costs related to those resiliency efforts. My question is, should we be doing the study first and finding out what the various options are and costs before actually moving forward with option one? It seems like we're putting the cart before the horse a little bit here. Do you have a comment on that?
Are you asking me?
Yes. Wouldn't it be preferable to have the results of the study to look at efforts and costs related to potential flooding before we actually move forward with this option?
I mean, this is speaking for me, Becky Bunnell, not Flood and Erosion Control Board, because we have not addressed that specifically and voted on that as a board. But my sense is that we should address the NOV, which is lowering the grade beam down to 8 feet. Whether that gets done as option one or option two, that's not something the board has an opinion on, and the Board of Selectmen has already approved only option one at this point. But I do believe that grade beam should be lowered, and the Flood and Erosion Control Board also, I believes the grade beam should be lowered. That being said, we don't want to wait and do the study after the project's been completed. We feel it's critically important that we do the study right now, and so that we could begin remediation efforts to reduce the flood risk as soon as we have results of the study back.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Marmion. All right. Any further questions on this topic? Okay. So just to wrap it up then, I just want to make sure, is there a line item in this proposal for this $100,000? And if so, can you point it out?
No, there's not a line item, but it's in the, we're incorporating it into the contingency on the town's behalf.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bremer. Ms. Bunnell, I just want to thank you again for being willing to take the time to be here. We really appreciate it. Thank you again. Okay. So if I could suggest for the board that we start to look at the numbers. As I said, we do have, and I don't know how we want to do this on the town side, but we do have someone here from Bismarck who assisted in preparing these estimates. So I don't know how we want to go through this, but one thing I would request, if we could, is to try to help us understand how these numbers tie into the $11.5 million request. I mean, I had some trouble figuring that out. I think a few of us tried to put some numbers together, and with a few plugs we got there, but we weren't exactly sure. So it would be helpful to understand how these numbers actually add up to the appropriation that's being requested. And we can do that either first or second, but and then it would be good to sort of walk through this, this cost estimate. So I don't know who wants to kick us off with that.
Sure. Eli Gazal here. So yeah, we broke them up. If we just turn to the slide here that says option one, which is to maintain the building. So this is broken up into 3 separate, what I like to call buckets. First, give us everybody a second here. All right, so the first bucket is the Julian fill removal. That is estimated to be $5 million. I'm not sure if you guys have colored copies or not,
but that is one of these Weston and Sampson estimates. There should be two of them in the backup. One of them equates to 5 million.
Madam Chair, can we ask questions as we go along? I think it would be helpful if that's okay.
Yeah, that would be fine. Before you do that, so that, can I just, is that 5021,
Page 4 of
549?
our backup.
That is correct, yeah.
Okay.
So if you allow me just to go through this, then you guys
Sure,
can
sorry.
turn to questions. And then,
Perfect.
just so everybody's on the same page as to
That
where
would-
we are and what we're
That
looking
would be
at.
great.
Perfect.
Okay.
Maybe, Eli, just to simplify it, it's $1 million less if we remove the building, to remove the soil, $1 million more, because it's a little bit more tricky to get the soil out.
Right, so we're going through option one right now, right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So the first one is this 5 million Weston Sampson single page equates to 5,021,000. The second bucket here is construction requirements. That is going to be the Bismarck estimate. On the top right underneath the Bismarck logo, you will see construction enabling and restoration. This is double-sided here, so the backside equates to 3.552.
Okay, great. So just for anybody that may be following along, that's 3,552,169, right? Okay.
Correct. Then the third bucket is a FEMA NOV. Again, that is a Bismarck estimate. On the top right underneath the Bismarck logo, you have demo and rebuild foundations at elevation 8 feet. This is one side, so one piece of paper equates to $3,052,567. Those are the three buckets that equate to option one.
Great, thank you very much. And just for clarity, so the 11.5 million is rounded. So that's, and we assume that was the case. So the 11,626,285 is the total, and that's rounded to 11.5 for this, for purposes of the resolution.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Question? When were these
Mr.
estimates?
Stark? Oh, go
When were
ahead.
these estimates made?
The estimates began in October, I want to believe, and then we obviously revised them to break them up into these three buckets here per options. So then option two, you guys will see again, it is broken up into three buckets there. The first bucket being demo building and foundations. That is going to be the Bismarck estimate here. Right underneath the Bismarck logo, it says demolish main buildings and foundations. That equates to $2,010,436. The second bucket is the Julian fill removal, which, as Brenda says, is $4 million, $1 million less than option one. That is this Weston Sampson here. Again, if it's colored copy, it would be green. Equates to $3,984,149. And then the final bucket is the basic necessities. That is this single sheet here, labeled Penfield Pavilion, basic necessities estimates.
And that's that's an internal estimate, right?
That is correct, yep.
Okay, thank you.
And then we have Greg here and myself, so if you guys have any questions.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Testani?
Thank you. I just have a couple. First, how are you, Greg? Good to see you. It's been a while. Just on the fill pile itself, and I'm sorry, let me make sure I differentiate it with the sand underneath the pavilion. So FEMA found that the sand itself is contaminated, right? I'm guessing with PCBs, correct? So does the removal have to then fall under FEMA regulation, for lack of a better word? Does it have to be removed in a certain way? Does someone from FEMA have to be present when we're removing it?
The short answer is no, it's DEEP and EPA. They're the regulatory body that we have to deal with when we talk about remediation of the soil itself. And to our knowledge, there are no PCBs directly under the building. They're more located in the parking lot. But all the contaminated fill, it's contaminated with a number of other toxins, that's going to have to be removed. And yes, there'll be DEEP and EPA people who've already approved our removal. I'm assuming they're going to come down and inspect and that sort of thing while it's going on.
So that would be similar to the other remediation in all the other sites that had been contaminated throughout the town, right? In
That's
terms of
exactly
okay.
correct.
Okay, and as far as the removal, I think you may have told me this before, and just for clarity, and perhaps some of the other board members had a similar question. So whether we do this option one, we all approve it tonight or not, the removal piece is the requirement from FEMA, is that right? The removal of the sand. So what is?
No, that's the removal by DEEP and EPA.
DEEP, I'm sorry, I'm
all right.
confusing my
It's all right.
acronyms. And it's 4 million if we renovate the building and 3 million if we knock it down, correct?
No, it's 4 million if the building is removed and there's nothing above it. It's 5 million or thereabouts if the building exists.
And what's the reason for that? I know, and again, I think you may have explained this, but if you could just remind us. It's $1 million, basically, right?
That's correct.
Difference,
And the
yeah.
major difference is how you remove it. It's a lot easier to remove something when there's no building above it. We have to vacuum it
sense.
out, that sort of thing. It's just much more involved and much more detailed.
Okay, that's it for now, Madam Chair. I'm sure I'll have more later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testani. Mr. Curley?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for coming. I appreciate it. I'm going to ask some questions that are mostly Bismarck-related. I'll try and stick to that. So first off, I just wanted to ask, can you just give us a little bit of background on your company and how much experience you have with this type of operation, coastal engineering experience or otherwise?
Greg Ravesey, Bismarck. So we've been in business 40 years, and over the course of time, I've built projects along the coastline. Something you might be familiar with is Black Rock, the aquaculture school, and then also Longfellow, I think they call it Kaler School now. Other projects along the coastline, kind of limited, other than we just finished Steel Point, where Boca is. A lot of times when there's FEMA involved, a lot of that goes along with the engineering and documents prior to coming through. And then our position is we have to implement whatever's required by FEMA. So there's definitely experience. And most recently, I just did a site cleanup over at Hubble on State Street. But the two schools in Bridgeport and also with Steel Point, they all had contaminated soils. So we have a huge experience level with contaminated soils. And one that was most recently wrapped up was Hubble along State Street in Bridgeport. It seems to be the norm lately.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Appreciate that. And I recognize that it's going to be Weston and Sampson who's going to be doing the deep-related work, so I won't direct questions.
Yeah, but a lot of that has to be orchestrated by us, and it gets very complicated to work in that environment with toxic soils.
Okay, thank you. So one of the things, I guess the question that I have, just in terms of the detail that was provided, did your firm provide this detail, or was this summarized by the administration?
No, we pretty much took our detailed estimate and then broke it down into packages for the presentation for the board.
Okay, that's helpful. And I note that on the letterhead it says conceptual estimate. Can you spend a little time educating us on what goes into a conceptual estimate and how that may differ from perhaps a construction estimate or something that might be more detailed?
Well, along the way, when you do construction documents and you get familiar with the project, you start out with a design team that comes up with an idea, and according to, I don't really know the dates, but when we got the engineers together, we kind of conceptually put together our thought process, what would be the best option, and based on that, you develop a CD estimate, in which we did, and then we develop a DD estimate, which is design development, where we are today. And I think timeline-wise, what we have in front of us is if it is approved, I think it's going to take a few months to finalize the documents that we need to go out to bid. Obviously, everything that we do has to be bid through the town. So these numbers are representing what we see as the best option in course of action to do what we have to do under the building. So this is based on a DD estimate. The next phase will be to finalize the drawings, comb the drawings, then pick up all the little nuances we might have missed.
Okay, that's helpful. And DD is design drawings, correct?
Correct. We have some designs that we came up with after a lot of discussions on how to handle the foundations.
Okay, so one of the concerns that I have is that not too long ago, we had a project come before this board with conceptual estimates, and when more detailed estimates were provided 6 months later, they increased by triple. So I wanted to ask you some questions about the specific line items. That's okay. So starting with the foundation renovations page, which totals the $3,052,567. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, roughly 4 line items that are relevant. So $200,000, $204,520 for general conditions. What would you envision being a confidence level of that number, and how might that vary?
General conditions is basically covering the supervision and what I need to manage the project. But I think this package of demo, the foundations, and to elevation 8 is pretty identified in its own package. You know, so if you take the grouping of them all together, I think there's enough time to cover what you have to do. But I think to answer your question as to cost-wise, what I foresee before coming back, we've really developed a real understanding of what has to be done here for this project. And I feel very confident with the numbers that I'm giving you today.
So you would say a high level of confidence that the general conditions quote of 204, estimate of 204, should be in line with the numbers needed once we get to it further down the road?
For this task, yes.
And would you say the same would be true for the $450,000 on the existing conditions line?
Yes.
And now I note that these estimates were started, I think it was October, is what Eli had mentioned. Concrete work, I imagine, is perhaps a bigger variable. It's certainly a bigger number. What is your level of confidence that the $1,755,000 might vary?
I think when we developed the estimate, we included an escalation factor, and I think everybody's kind of concerned about cost control. But based on what we've seen with our most recent bids, commodities have kind of leveled off. So I'm pretty confident where we are.
And this work, this concrete work, would require a pretty unique set of skills to be able to go under an existing building that has not been moved, and working not with a large pour, not doing it. You're going to have to do it section by section, correct? I imagine that increased the cost quite a bit.
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
Okay. Now, when I did note that when I look at the subtotal of the construction cost, 2.4 million, and the subtotal of hard costs is 2.8, there's not anything that bridges that gap. Can you help explain what that $382,000 difference would be?
Can you just ask the question one more time?
Sure. So if I look at the total construction costs on this schedule, it's 2.409,520. If I look at the subtotal of hard costs, it's 2,791,937. But it does not explicitly state or explain the $382,000 difference between those two numbers. Well, what might that consist of?
That's basically when you're there's a tendency when you put estimates together, there's an overflow factor between the two. So it's like the gap that fills everything that needs to be done between the activities, if that answers your question.
So just to add to that, so those are the difference between the two numbers is what equates to the hard costs, which includes insurance, the construction manager pre-construction fee, bond costs, Greg's CM fee, contingency, and escalation.
So those are the costs that cover what you have to do to manage the project, pretty much what I was getting after.
Okay, so it's if I heard you correctly, Eli, the 6 or 7 line items that are described on this schedule make up the difference, the 382K. It's just not explicitly stated.
That is correct.
All right, that's helpful. Thank you. And I noticed that there's a project contingency in here. Do we know what the percentage of that project contingency is?
I think there's a 5% construction contingency and a 4.5% owner's contingency. And then on top of that, we have a 1% escalation contingency.
A 1% escalation fee.
It was just October, and I kind of thought we were going to start in December, but things got a kind of bottleneck.
Right, and I do know that construction costs are escalating at a greater rate than general inflation, so that's a potential risk, correct?
As I mentioned before, costs have kind of leveled off a little bit, so I feel pretty confident where we are, especially with the contingencies we're carrying.
Okay.
Mr. Curley, while you're looking at your notes, can I just ask a quick question? Have you overseen a project similar to this previously, where you've taken out contaminated materials under a standing building on a beach?
It's unique.
It is unique, yeah. And the reason I'm asking, and I didn't mean to be facetious, but as I think about this, I think about the length of time that it will take to extract those materials, the fact that we've got waves of water coming back and forth. We have those materials are contaminated. The risk of sort of keeping that site open for a long period of time while we have water and potentially a storm and all of those things. So it did sound unique to me. So it's unique. Okay. And part of that gets to, I think, the concern about just the risk of the costs and the fact that, when we go to do this, we might, change the, I mean, is there any risk? Well, let me step back for a minute. How did you come to the conclusion that this was the best approach to take? And is there some risk that once we start this process, that we may decide for whatever reason, kind of being on the beach as it is, that this is not the best way to go? We might have to revert to, a different plan of doing it, say moving the building or something else.
From everything that we know at the moment, everything that I know at the moment, this is the best option that I see. And the biggest
best in terms of cost, or what defines best for you?
It's the option that best comes to mind of what needs to be done. To lower the foundations, it's not the building's fault, as you would say. We're to the point where we got to redo the foundations. I think the approach we have now is number one. I don't really see any other way of doing what we have to do.
Okay, and did you consider moving the building? And if not, was that a matter of cost, or would that be a matter of, maybe structural integrity of the building if it gets moved? Or can you talk about that a little bit?
I don't think moving the building is any longer an option. It's almost like when you go to the doctor to get knee surgery. Do they operate on the knee twice? The building has been moved once. The building's been installed back in its location. To move it again, I think the cost, we don't have a conception of what the cost would be. You'd be spending money against bad money. I just don't think it works.
Thank you. Can I let Mr. DeWitt go, and then we'll circle back? Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Curley, with the the project that you were referring to that went up 3 times, that was the trunk line, correct? Yeah. So thank you for that. Sir, how much steel is involved in this project?
Whatever structural rebar that we need for the foundations, tonnage-wise, I don't have a number in my head.
No, I'm not looking for tonnage. So the project Mr. Curley referred to was significantly impacted by massive amounts of steel. I mean, I think this is not a big steel project, right? Well, I thought steel. Yeah, I think steel was driving in a lot of industries. I thought in that project especially. Boy. Okay. No, there was still but there was a significant increase in steel. I mean, I look at this estimate, and you know, like you say that moving this building again. I don't know if everyone remembers, but we cut this building in half, and we demolished a quarter of it, not quite a half. We demolished a lot of this building, moved this thing, and then moved it back. So just picking this up and moving it into the parking lot is no easy task, right? I can't imagine it would be cheaper than doing this. Maybe for the workers on the field, it might be a little bit easier after it's moved. But yeah, I'm with you. Moving this building again just seems impractical. And again, I remember there was a lot of things that went into this. The glass was removed. Half the building was destroyed. You know, so I'm kind of with you. Listen, I don't like the number, but you know, I think the number seems to make sense in the current environment we're in, that we're not, and especially without a significant amount of steel. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeWitt. Mr. Stark? No? Okay. Mr. Curley?
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to, I recognize that you provided 3 schedules. I'm not going to get into the one for the option 2 with the demo, but I did want to run through a similar series of questions on the second half of option 1, and that is the rebuilding, the demo and rebuilding the foundations, the I guess the building renovations, which totals up to the 2 pages, totals up to the 3.552. Same answers, I suppose. General conditions, 282K. You're comfortable with that number?
Yes.
Existing conditions, 583K.
Yes.
High level of confidence. Okay. Wooden, plastics, and composites is 600K. That's just the materials that you're, like the skirting and things like that, they're going to have to be replaced, correct?
Rebuilding the decks, there's a lot that has to go happen here.
Yep. Okay. Earthwork, the 935. How does that differ from some of the other work that Weston and Sampson is going to be doing?
There's a lot, like when you look at the building, you're standing in the parking lot. When we start, that grade is going to be all the way through. So we have to access to start our work from the parking lot side. So there's a lot of site work that has to happen around the building where we have to move the sand, we have to clear the building. There's a lot of complications involved as we orchestrate the removals that we have to do first.
Okay. And is the contingency for these projects, 2 line items here, project contingency and owner's contingency, same thing, 5%, 4.5%, same assumption across the board? Okay. That's fine on the numbers. I just had a couple questions regarding, I just think it would be helpful to clarify for the board and for the public, what is Bismarck's role currently? Obviously, you've been engaged to do a lot of work to provide this estimate. Are you under contracted to do the work? Are you planning on bidding to do the work? Or what is your role currently? What do you expect your role to be going forward?
If I could answer that question, we did basically an RFQ for construction managers, for architects, for structural engineers, for geotechnical engineers. So we've done the RFQ. We interviewed a bunch of different companies in each of those areas, and we selected Bismarck as well as others. They are not under contract as we speak because we don't have the money. So we're waiting for approvals first before we start negotiating their contracts and all that kind of stuff that we will be doing. Once they are set up, that's when the RFP process will begin for the subcontractors that will be included in terms of doing the actual work. So that that all has to wait until we have approval of the funding.
So is Bismarck going to be acting as a construction manager?
Yes.
So we're going out, following the purchasing policy, we're going to go out for bids, RFPs for the subcontractor work. Does that also mean that we're going out for RFPs for construction manager, or has
No.
that been?
We've already decided that based on the RFQs. We sent RFQs out. We brought in a number of different companies to interview, and we selected them as their construction manager pending approval of the funding.
How many different responses did you get to those RFQs?
Three on the construction manager. There were different ones for the architect and the structural and the geotechnical engineers.
Okay, last question for me, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues. Once this project actually gets the green light and can get started, how long do you expect this to be from start to finish?
Timeline-wise, say that we got approval within the next few weeks. I think it's going to be probably July before we go out for public bid. There's a lot to be done document-wise with the engineers that we need to follow through with. And if we go out to bid, numbers come back in August, I think we're an October 1st start.
And completion?
Based on what we need to do, I think it's anywhere from, I hope it's less, but it's anywhere from 7 to 9 months. And it's just the complexity of what has to be done under the building.
Understood. Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. I have a quick follow-up. Does anyone else have a follow-up on this? Okay. So, Tom, just to clarify, the RFQ, how is that treated in our kind of purchasing world? Do we treat this as sort of like professional services?
Yes.
So we didn't go out for a traditional like triple bid or anything like that. We got RFQs, but you made a determination based on, professional expertise versus just. Is that how that works?
That's exactly how it works.
Okay. And can I ask the same question about Weston and Sampson? We keep talking about them. Are they, this is a $5 million project. Did we bid for that?
So what we did with Weston and Sampson, when I first got involved with the 40 sites, putting aside Penfield for a moment, when we got involved with the 40 sites, the original LEP was Tie and Bond, and they are still doing a bunch of work for the town, but we felt that that it was almost too much for them. There were too many sites. So we went out and did the same exact thing. We did an RFQ. We had a number of different other companies bid, basically, with their qualifications as to whether or not they could do remediation of the different sites. And from that group, we picked Weston and Sampson. And so they started working on the fill pile, and they were the ones who came for Penfield, and they wanted to do additional testing to supplement a lot of the testing that Tie and Bond had done. And because they've been working so closely and so well for the town, we just continued to use them. So they are subject to an RFQ. They were selected based on their background, and they do a lot of this stuff and that sort of thing. And so we did not go out separately for yet another RFQ for Penfield because we were using them on a number of the fill pile as well as Penfield.
Madam Chair, can I?
Yeah,
follow
let
up
me
on
just,
on that point?
I just have a follow-up, and then yeah, I'll come right back to you. Yeah, and I understand the RFQ, but this is a $5 million remediation project. Would we not have looked to a bid process just for cost?
Well, I guess it's a $5 million project. I'm not sure. It's not $5 million to Weston and Sampson. They're going to be doing the same exact thing. They're going to be putting out RFPs for the subcontractors that they will be using. They're only managing this $5 million issue. They don't get a check for $5 million. What they do is basically exactly what our construction manager is doing. They're going to put RFPs out for different, all the subcontractors they'll use, the people that are trucking the stuff away and that sort of thing. Those are all subcontractors that will be reporting through Weston and Sampson to the town. So yes, it is a big project, but so is the fill pile a big project, and so are the other 40 sites are big projects. Ty and Bond is doing those, Weston and Sampson is doing the fill pile, and Penfield right now. Exactly, yeah.
Madam Chair, just
Mr. Testani?
go along your lines of question there. So Tom, on the Weston and Sampson, were they doing some of the other 40 sites? That's A, in terms of the remediation, but B, if it was the fill pile, I'm guessing they had to do this, a similar sort of role in terms of how they were going to handle it. It's not in a similar way, we didn't write them a check to handle the fill pile, correct? They had to also.
No, I mean, basically what they're doing is they're interfacing with DEEP and EPA. They are managing how we're going to approve, how we're going to do an RAP. They're going to go forward with a plan, and they're going to get DEEP and EPA to sign off on those plans. Once that happens, once they have approval, they will then do a bidding process with subcontractors, as I mentioned earlier, about trucks coming, who's the truckers,
Right.
who's going to be the actual diggers, who's going to be, and they will monitor the site. They will do additional testing when the remediation's conducted, and then they will file appropriate documents with DEEP and EPA at the very, very end, and they'll close the site. So they're much more, as Mr. DeWitt just said, they're much more of a general contractor,
Right.
general manager of the remediation efforts.
And they did this same sort of responsibility with the fill pile, that's what you're saying, right?
They're doing the
Correct.
fill pile as well as Penfield.
And did they have any responsibility for any of the other 40 sites, or was that all Ty and Bond?
That's all Ty and Bond.
Okay. All right, very good. Thank you. I was just curious. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testani. Mr. Curley?
Yeah, thank you. And recognizing that Weston and Sampson is not here tonight, I can ask the question of you. Are you comfortable that these estimates are probable, high level of confidence? I recognize that you've made it clear in many public meetings that a lot of this is dependent on how much contaminated fill we find, and we got to keep digging until.
You stole my thunder.
Yeah, so I've heard that part, but and I think everyone has, and I think everyone appreciates that point. We're gonna get all the bad stuff out. I get that, but what I'm worried about is the numbers as they hit the paper.
No, I think it's fair to say that if the amount of fill that we find, contaminated fill that we find, is what we anticipate, then I think these numbers are very accurate.
And I guess the one open question to me on these estimates is the $1 million difference between getting the building out of the way or not, right? I guess those methods are going to be.
If I may, the best way I can describe that is if the building is no longer existing there, it's a lot easier to dig out than it is to vacuum under a building. And what they believe is if the building exists, they're going to have to do a lot of the removal of the contaminated fill through a vacuum process. That's much more costly, much more difficult to deal with. If there was no building, you just get some bobcats and start digging, that kind of thing. It's a lot easier.
And frankly, I'm honestly surprised that it's only $1 million difference. So.
Just one clarification on this whole bidding question. So does this follow the town's bidding process? So when these general contractors go out, whether it's Weston and Sampson or Bismarck, the process to go out to bid
is within our purchasing policy.
Right. So that's going to be a process that's managed by or it goes through the town and our purchasing department, correct?
I'm sorry? Yeah, they will be acting, the construction manager as well as the Weston and Sampson will be acting on behalf of the town. So the town's going to see all the bids that come in. The town will help in the facilitation of the issuance of the RFPs and that sort of thing. But when the RFPs come in and everything, we're going to see them. We're going to sit with the construction manager. We'll sit with Weston and Sampson, and we will be part of that discussion about who should we pick, that sort of thing.
Got it. Thank you. Jim or Mr. Welsh?
Mr. Bremer, we're responsible, correct, for whatever toxins we find no matter how deep they go, correct?
That is
So if
correct.
there was cost overruns on the cleanup of the toxins that the previous administration spread all over the town, we're responsible for that if it goes 2 feet deep, 1 foot deep, or 100 feet deep under current United States environmental law, correct?
That's absolutely correct.
Okay. So the estimates that we have now are on the best standing information based on the soil samples that have been taken at the site, correct?
That's correct.
So this is the only information we have and the best available information.
That's correct.
But you're not promising that if we find we had missed a test spot and that test spot goes down 100 feet, that we're going to be able to live with the numbers we have, correct?
That's correct, unfortunately.
Yeah, okay. So just on the best available numbers.
Exactly.
Okay, and whether, I mean, this doesn't live or die then on whether we either repair Penfield to the way we want to or not. The environmental section is its own animal.
Well, I guess yes, that's absolutely correct. I look at Penfield like if the building's there or it's not there, the remediation we have to deal with regardless of the cost.
That number's going to be that number no
It's the
matter
same.
what happens.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Mr. Mottola?
Thank you. Just following up on that. So Tom, the Weston and Sampson estimate, has Deep approved this plan?
Yes, they have.
Okay. And is there a contingency built into this estimate to take into consideration what Mr. Walsh just said, that there may be more fill that we have to get out of there?
No, I can't say that there's a
Okay.
contingency to cover all potential possibilities. No, there's not.
All right, thanks.
Is
Thank
there
you,
any
Mr. Patel.
contingency at all?
Yeah, I
In-
think
in-
10%.
Where do we see that in the schedule?
No, it's built into the numbers. That's what I've been told by Weston and Sampson.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, as we spoke about, for a while now, we're hoping, based on the invoices, that there's 5 feet of soil. And we have tested every square. You would not believe the amount of testing we've had to do, based on what DEEP and EPA want us to do. Not just there, but at the fill pile as well. Everything's tested, it's just how far down. And like with anything else, if they pull all 5 feet out, maybe there's another half a foot, and maybe there's another foot. We don't know that answer right now.
Thank you. Follow-up questions on that? Mr. Stark?
Yeah, Ms. Kupchak and I had a pretty useful offline exchange about a week ago where I had communicated with FEMA directly, and they were, Mr. Bremer was CC'd, and then I and he probably showed it to Ms. Kupchak and got her take on it. And what we were talking about was whether we could, for the purposes of the March 31st deadline, simply tell FEMA that we intended to adopt option 1, 2, or 3, all of which would make the site compliant. And in our conversation, Ms. Kupchak indicated that they wouldn't accept that. I thought maybe it'd be good if you could elaborate a little, and maybe some of the team could elaborate on why they wouldn't take the Chinese menu options.
So Mr. Stark had asked Mr. Bremer if all of our boards had approved of a myriad of options. Like, maybe we'll do this, maybe we'll do that, kind of like, here's, I don't know, 10, I think that's what you meant, right? Like $10 million, $11 million, but let us figure out which way. I thought it would be easier just to have a phone conversation than try to go through a whole email just to say, no. They want the compliance. That's all they want. Now, I think most of you heard the meeting or watched that meeting. They just want the gray beams at the level they want for a reason. They said if the water hits it at that level that it's at now, it has more of a likelihood to break apart and cause more damage to the surrounding homes. They want it lower because they believe it flows easier and whatever. They're scientists. I'm not.
Can you just elaborate on that? You're saying if the building as it is now,
The gray beans,
okay, so in a storm,
they need to be lowered. to
right, but
the-
in a
right.
storm, that building presents more of a hazard today.
That's what I believe they said. Because
Okay,
they said the
so-
wave action or whatever hits
Way,
those
this
beams.
building could become a projectile or whatever.
Or break apart.
Okay.
Right, and then smash into somebody's house.
Right, okay.
But no, what Mr. Sark was asking was, could we just give a myriad of Chinese menu option and then say, hey, FEMA, all the boards passed, maybe we're going to do one of these three things. And I told them that no. I don't believe that's what I ever heard in any meetings from them. They want either the building gone or they want us to lower it. And they want to hear from me in my request for remediation on behalf of our town. All three funding bodies have passed this to fix this building. Please don't retrograde us. And as I mentioned at the Board of Selectmen meetings and at the other meetings, that the congressman and the two United States senators agreed to sign on to a letter asking for that consideration, which would be attached to our town letter. But no, they want to see, to be quite honest, and I said this earlier, I said this at the Board of Selectmen meeting, when we began our conversations with FEMA, it was our first real conversations when they sent the letter in June. They weren't happy with the town of Fairfield. And that doesn't mean they weren't happy with me, because they didn't know me. But they weren't happy with the way the town of Fairfield responded to them over the course of whatever many years. They were angry. And so we had to establish a relationship and a rapport that we had full intention of complying with the law 100%. But what does that mean exactly? Tell us. And so, it's a back and forth with the agency. Go back and forth. But as we established a relationship, they understood we meant to comply with the law. That's what we meant to do. But with the caveat that I'm not, the queen. I can't just say, oh yeah, I'm going to do this. I have to go through all the town boards, and they have a lot of questions, and they need to be answered, or I can't comply with the law. So they understood that. But at this point in time, that's why I think they kind of called a chip in. Like, okay, Fairfield, that's enough. You know what you need to do. You've submitted a plan. Go get your funding bodies to cover it, to pass it, and then and then send your letter of reconsideration in, and then we'll review it, which I believe means they will take us seriously, that we're taking this seriously. Because honestly, it felt like throughout those conversations, they felt like Fairfield was not taking their regulations serious.
Yeah.
So you're clearly going to write a letter of reconsideration, but you wanted to have this option already approved when in that letter.
The letter's drafted.
Got it. Okay.
So as soon as, and if we can get through all three boards, it will go out directly before the deadline.
Okay. I have unrelated questions.
Certified
and I
mail.
sense John has related questions. Oh, okay. All right. Well, I get a little scattershot here, but I'm actually really loath to knock down a revenue-producing building. We spent $4 million on turf fields that they have some revenue attached to them, but they don't have this much revenue attached to them. And I see from the 2023 budget that we got $406,500 of revenue from the building, and we had costs of $203,000, so it has a 50% profit margin. Are we aware whether there are any revenue or cost line items elsewhere in the budget tied to Penfield other than the Penfield part of the budget?
Anthony?
Anthony, are you still here? So in addition to that, Mr. Stark and I discussed what I brought up earlier, that the Park and Rec Commission could potentially bringing up the rates to that building, because they haven't touched them since 2018.
Yeah.
And it's quite a deal.
Yeah, and I think, if I can paraphrase, I think the question is, are there, because I think in the Penfield budget, you probably have direct costs, but are there other indirect costs that aren't included in that 200,000. So people who book the facility, or, you know, a portion of your time, or whatever that might be. Like, what is, I think that's the question.
Sure. Anthony Calabrese, Director of Parks and Recreation, and thank you for the question. The only costs that are not contained in the Penfield budget itself would be full-time staffing. So anything that happens through my office when it's a reservation that has to take place, filling out the paperwork, everything else, for the most, to my knowledge, is included in that budget. And that was the way that I believe the Board of Finance, I believe this board, some of you may have been on the board when we separated out Penfield years ago and tried to make it its own cost center.
All right, and I'll just make a comment then. You know, Mr. Walsh raised a really good point. No matter how deep that bad fill is, that's a sunk cost. And so you're starting out in the hole, and you have to just sort of accept that.
Yep.
You're probably based on the slide deck, you're $6 million in the hole to begin with. You can't escape that.
Right.
So you're really looking at incremental costs from this point forward. And they're either the extra $2.5 million for the lesser option, option 2, or another 5 for the better option. And, you know, if you think you can increase the net income on this building each year, you're starting to actually get into a reasonable payback period if you choose the more expensive option. That's just my observation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stark. Mr. Mottola?
So while Anthony's up here, just, and this is a question for you too, Brenda. So we if this is approved, we don't anticipate starting this until October. Are we going to open up the building this summer? Is there a plan to use it?
So, you know, listen, we had originally wanted to have this thing start in the fall, and, you know, and so we were like, let's not book anything, because God forbid people have to cancel their wedding. There's going to be an angry mob of brides at Town Hall. So, and believe me, I don't want that. So, we didn't take any reservations. So now that things are, you know, it's been taking longer than we thought originally. And listen, it's government. The plan is, as you were discussing earlier, we would like to start at the end of the summer, early fall, and have just one season out. So to Anthony's point, we talked about this. Anthony's like, at this point, people who would have had a wedding this summer, they're planned. Like, they have a place. It's not like somebody's just going to plan a wedding in a couple of months. Maybe there will be. It all depends. Like, if we get the go-ahead and we have and the town boards agree to maintain the building and not knock it down, then we could, you know, I mean, there could be reunions or maybe other events. You want to jump in?
But before you talk about, that's fine. You probably could do that. But aside from that, just the public being able to use the building during the week and weekends, just to use the bathroom, the concession,
yes,
lockers.
100%.
We're going to open it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm not sure that's budgeted
No, I don't want
yet,
2
so-
seasons. I just want
So we
one.
got to, when we look at your budget, I think we're going to have to add a
So
couple of
let
bucks
me
to that. Go ahead.
just chime in here, because you will hear this, I believe, late tomorrow night. Right? They always
Now
put
you
me. They
gotta
always
move-
put me last
you
on the
gotta
agenda.
move it-
so-
Oh, DeWitt, you put
Well,
it
I don't
last
think
on
you
the-
did.
If some people don't ask a lot of questions, it might be an early night, so, okay.
To your point, the way we budgeted for the budget that we'll be discussing tomorrow for fiscal '24 was with the anticipation that the building was going to be closed. So you will see that reflected in the budget. However, it was asked by the Board of Selectmen to present a contingency plan to say, hey, if we gave you the green light and you're not going to start any construction this summer, what does that look like? So you'll see that. I can talk about that contingency tomorrow, but again, it's not a lot of money. It's more for the convenience of the public to be able to use the amenities. Obviously, the bathrooms would be open if we're not under construction. I've got the concessionaire lined up, ready to go. That all had gone out to bid. He's got 1-year extensions now, where again he knows he's waiting to see if we're going to be there. Lockers will have to do a whole nother thing, but that revenue wouldn't be realized in the '24 budget. It would be realized in the current budget. Concessionaire, same thing. Half his payment would be in the current budget. The other half would be in next year's budget. And those, again, the rentals would primarily be, if we were estimating about 15 rentals, but again, most likely in the 24 budget after July. And again, those would be ceremonies of life, retirement parties, birthday parties. Again, I don't really see the big weddings happening down there, but that's the answer.
But can I just, does it matter? I mean, do we charge less for a celebration of life if somebody's going to use the whole building than a wedding, or is it the same?
So there's tiered pricing, and it's based on the day and time that you book. So obviously, off the top of my head, I believe Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays are the most expensive. Those are prime time. I think somebody was referencing $3,500 for residents, $4,500 for non-residents. But if you booked a Monday night, yeah, that could be a $700 rental.
Got it.
Or if somebody wanted to book a Tuesday night, same type of thing.
Okay, thank you.
Can I
Mr.
just
Testani?
have a quick follow-up on
Yep.
that, Madam Chair? So, Anthony, on the rates that Brenda was referring to, and we'll probably, again, talk about this at some point tomorrow night, but so is it the Parks Commission that changes those rates that Brenda mentioned? So not you, it wouldn't be you personally, it would be, right,
Nothing that we do in Parks and Recreation is ever me personally. Just want to make that public comment here, public record. Yes, the Parks and Recreation Commission does set the rates for the pavilion. However, the last set of rates was adopted in 2018, which is the 3,500 and the 4,500. Again, prime time rates that we're talking about.
in season or out of season?
In
that kind of
season,
thing.
out of
Yeah,
season,
right.
exactly. Those are competitive, very competitive rates for the facility that you get. And what you get with that facility is, any of you guys that have been to Penfield, you know essentially
Yeah, I
what
do
you're
know.
renting is the space, and that's what you're getting. If you want to use our chairs and tables, that's fine, but if you were having a wedding there, majority of the weddings aren't using our tables and chairs. They're bringing their own in, renting them. They're bringing in a caterer, because we don't offer any catering, right? We have a warming kitchen, and that's it, so you can't cook in there. So to have a wedding, you're still putting out a lot of money on the other things. But for the facility itself, you know, that $3,500 or $4,500 is a decent price. And again, when we do our comps, we see that we are right where we are, right where we're supposed to be.
All right, thank you.
No, thank you, Mr. Testani. Mr. Walsh?
I just want to follow up on Mr. Stark's, which I thought it was a great question because it's been something that's been on my mind thinking about this, which is the revenue side, which if the vote is not to approve this, then it's basically effectively going to be a tear down. And we will lose the 406,000, which should escalate. You know, you would probably normally look at an escalation, but over 10 years, just at $400,000, we'll make $4 million.
That's revenue, though.
That's
not,
that's revenue. What's
that's not the net, yeah.
Well, we have a bond outstanding. If we tear it down and that revenue's gone, Jared, do you know how much the bond cost is and how many more years we would be looking at a vacant property and paying a bond? Yeah, there's actually two.
Right, there are two bonds outstanding. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I believe the longest one remaining goes out to 2030. I want to say 2037, and the total amount of debt serviced on them is somewhere around 12 million. I'm going to say between 9 and 12 million.
All right. And without anything being there, no building, no revenue whatsoever, would be there.
Yeah, we'd still have that cost, if that's your question.
We'd be looking at
would
nothing.
Continue to pay that without the revenue and without the net income resulting from, you know, the balance of the revenue and the expenditure.
Ouch, that would hurt. Okay. And just following up also on another point that Mr. Stark made. So FEMA's expecting, if we want to file a letter of reconsideration. I saw the meeting. I wasn't there, but I saw it online. They seem to suggest that they would want to see some action. They'd want to see some voting, if not from all bodies. They said you could try to file it without all the bodies, but basically good luck. Correct? Am I misinterpreting that?
No, you're not. And just so you're all aware, we did immediately let them know it passed the Board of Selectmen, and that they know the dates of the other meetings. So, yeah, you're not mischaracterizing that.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Stark?
I forgot what may be the most important question for me. I asked this back in August when you gave the presentation, but I think you weren't ready to answer it yet. I'm wondering if you found out yet if the building is completely FEMA compliant and operating as the pavilion we know and love. Do you know how much insurance we can get on it?
You did ask that, and I don't know the answer to that. Does anybody know the answer to that? Do you mean like what we can insure it for?
Yeah. If it gets knocked down by a hurricane, how much can we get?
I don't know. I could ask, though. We could email FEMA, and I could forward the response to the board. I mean, I'm assuming if, it's estimated value, right? So when you have an insurance with flood insurance on a building, if it's your house or whatever it is.
Is it
I'm
entirely?
not familiar with
I'm sorry.
flood
Is
insurance.
it entirely insured by the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, or does it? Did it have?
It wasn't last time.
No,
So,
it was not. There's
Yeah.
there's a tiered approach that is taken. So FEMA has some limitation, and I cannot recall the level that was, but the last time we got full value on that. And then I thought we had excess insurance to cover some part of it, but not all of it, was my recollection.
is it like 60 or 70%? I'm trying to remember.
Thought it
Something.
was like 3 million total around.
Okay.
I can't recall
Yeah.
what exactly it was. But it certainly, when we were looking at it the last time, we were looking at a $3.5 million FEMA grant that was coming in that we never saw.
Right.
Or
Okay, thank you. Ms. Marmion?
Yeah, this sort of is a follow-up to that in terms of the current value of Penfield Pavilion. There have been a lot of questions about the revaluation of Penfield recently and where that came from, given that our town went through the 5-year reval. Penfield was valued at or appraised at a certain amount, and then it just came out that there's a new valuation. So first of all, what is the current value? And then can you talk to us about this process and how Penfield has a new valuation?
I certainly can. I would say around November of '21, I requested a new appraisal of Penfield. Why did I request it? Because I knew that this issue of the 50/50 rule may come into play. So I reached out to the town's assessor because I had no idea what the value of the building was at the time. And he told me at that time it was about $3.5 million or 3.4, something like that. And of course, I thought to myself, for 3.4 million, I should build 10 of these because it's got to be worth a lot more than that. I talked to the assessor. I said, let's get an appraisal on this. He goes, that's very rare that we ever appraise anything that goes up in value from a town side. But I said, so be it. So I had him reach out and get an outside appraiser to come in and appraise the building. And they came in at around 7.4 million. The town assessor looked at it and changed the value. I think he's down at 7.1 or 7.1 and change, 7.2, something like that. So that's the new appraised value.
So in terms of the assessor, did you have to go out for bids for that new assessment, or was our purchasing policy, did anything like that come into play in terms of how we went about that?
I really left it up to the town assessor. It's a professional service, so we don't need to RFP it. And I said I'd rather have somebody from outside the town just do this appraisal. I just thought it would be more efficient to do that, and that's what he did.
Thank you. And just for clarification, and I know there are questions, And maybe just for the benefit of the public, you made reference to the 50/50. And maybe you can just explain that for everyone, because I think there'll probably be some follow-up questions on that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to ask anyway, but
No, that's-
you didn't do anything wrong by mentioning it.
No, I slide into shorthand. The 50/50 rule, for those of you that don't know, that if you're in a flood zone, there is called the 50/50 rule, wherein if you make substantial improvements to the building that exceed 50% of the value of the building, you then have to comply with the latest regulations that pertain to that building in the flood zone. I was concerned that we may be, because I started to get numbers, we started talking about different scenarios, and I got concerned that we may be over the 50/50 rule. And at the time, since I didn't know the value of the building, I realized that these numbers that we were talking about are pretty extreme, and so I needed to get the value of the building. And once I did, I realized that this not only was the value, in my humble opinion, way too low for the building, but that would be an obstacle. So that's why I wanted somebody on the outside. I mean, I can make numbers up, but I'm nobody. So I wanted somebody from the outside to go in and get an appraisal.
That sounds like it was the right thing to do, but just the concern you had, if we go over the 50% based on some unforeseen cost, what does that do to the overall estimate?
If we go over the 50, if we are over 50% in terms of our fix, if you will, of the grade beams, then I've got a couple of things that we have to deal with. Number one, we'd have to raise the building, not the locker room portion. So how to tie those two buildings together creates a bit of a technological problem. I've been advised by the building department that the windows and some of the walls that face the water may have to be reinforced because there's new wind shear regulations that don't apply to the old building but would apply to a new building. So just hearing those, I don't want to get into the 50/50 rule quagmire, if you know what I mean.
Thank you. I do have some follow-up questions, but Mr. Curley and then Mr. Walsh.
Yeah, I'll stay on this topic and I'll be quick. But I do think it's important to get into a little bit of the 50/50 quagmire, so we'll go there. Just to clarify, is this 50/50 rule, you said it applies for properties in a flood zone. Is this a local requirement? Is it a federal requirement, state requirement? What's the specific requirement?
I'd ask Jim to come up.
It's both. It's part of the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, and as a participating community, we're obligated to adopt that as a local code, so it's both.
Okay, so thank you, Jim. And if I heard you correctly, Mr. Bremer, I agree with the I agree with the process to get the 7.4 number or to get an outside appraisal. That makes a lot of sense. That gives us a ceiling on what we can spend on the renovations, right? So it's half that number. If I heard you correctly, if we go over half that number, do we have to stop construction at that point and then raise the building, or would we not get a certificate of occupancy? What's the ultimate consequence there?
This has been a subject of conversation between the town and FEMA. What exactly is going to be in part of this calculation? They have already agreed that all the remediation efforts, all the getting rid of the dirt, getting rid of the decks to get to the dirt, all that kind of stuff is not included in any 50/50 calculation, which is why we split it up. The only reason, the only issue that they're focused on in terms of the 50/50 is the direct costs associated with removing the grade beams and reforming the grade beams. So that cost in and of itself. And if you look at our option one, you see the FEMA NOV, the last one is $3 million. So that's well below the 50/50 issue.
Is it the $3 million? There are three line items in option one. You've got the fill removal that's clearly not part of the equation for this 50/50 concern. You've got foundation renovations at $3 million. You've got the building renovations at $3.5 million. I would have thought that it would have been the 3.5 that would have been part of this 50/50 equation. Help us understand why it's not.
The best way I can describe that is in our conversations with FEMA, I was very specific. I said, you know, if we're just going to include the cost to remove the grade beams, get rid of to literally cut them out, to then dispose of those grade beams, and then include the cost to reform new grade beams, if that's what we're talking about, we're fine. And the answer I got back was, we want to see your numbers, but if that's what we're talking about, they're very comfortable with that.
So all of the work for the building renovations, the $3.5 million, that's not part of this 50/50 equation?
That is correct. The $3.5 million is construction requirement. So if we did not have the FEMA NOV, we would still be doing the second bucket. Correct. We still need to access the dirt.
Okay, so, all right, I'll accept that. So that means that at a $7.4 million valuation and a $3 million foundation renovation estimate, that gives, well, $3,052,567. So that gives us about $348,000 to work with. No.
That's correct.
No,
No, it's more than that. It's more than that.
Right. Okay, so it's
Yeah.
we have $1,407,000.
Half of
about
7.4 is 3.7, so we're looking at maybe a $700,000
yeah, 650,
contingent.
700,000. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Curley. Mr. Walsh?
Mr. Bremer, the $7.4 million appraisal, was that on the structure itself, or was that on the appraisal for the entire parcel?
No, structure itself.
Just the structure
The land
itself.
is valued at over $20 million.
That's what I thought you said, but I just wanted to confirm that. And the other question I had was on, I'll think of it right now. I was waiting, so.
Thank you. Mr. Stark?
Oh, this is a quick one. Can it be sold to the private sector?
Penfield Pavilion?
Yes, and the land.
I would assume that the purchases that have occurred before, or sales before, would require all three boards to agree, and I would assume it could be.
But no, like FEMA or federal regulation preventing selling the beachfront property, right?
I don't believe there's a federal regulation preventing us.
Got it. Not saying I want to do that. I'm just curious. Just to sort of understand that there could be a real-world market test out there to verify, the appraiser's view.
Thank you. Any other follow-ups? I have a follow-up on this, but any other follow-ups on this point? Okay. So, and Tom, you described if we, let's say we're off for whatever reason, the 700,000, we sort of exceed that threshold, we exceed the 50%, and we have to be there. I guess my question, if we did that, two things would have to happen, or mainly. I mean, I don't know what else it would be, but to get up to current code, we'd have to raise the building, and we'd basically have to put in hurricane windows or whatever, right? So did we consider doing that anyway? I mean, and the reason I ask that is, if I were putting in money into my own property that was equal to half of what it was worth, I think I would definitely consider making it more resilient, because I would want to protect my asset. So if the current code is for the building to be a foot higher and to have windows, which I have put in hurricane windows on another beachfront property I have, and you want them there when you have that kind of thing. Why did we make that decision? I mean, I'm assuming it was a cost decision, but what would the cost of doing that be, and what's the thought process about not complying with code, if other than cost, if anything?
So I think, well, obviously, we don't want to go over the cost, the 50/50 rule. And I think it's a similar issue that Sherman, like when I was on the Board of Ed and we were making renovations or we were voting on projects for Sherman, we always kept it below the 50, so it had to be incrementally done. You couldn't do it all at once. So we would do some project, and then we would wait a couple years and do a little bit more. So we would remain under the 50/50. We weren't doing all that work at once. Listen, if the boards are interested in doing things like that after the fact, but I remember
No, and I
when
I don't
that
think we would
bill-
do it after the fact.
No, no, I mean replacing windows. You can replace a window anytime. But if I remember the last time it got knocked down, which I thought was so amazing, not a single one of those windows cracked. They all,
In fact,
which
in
was,
fact, we
the
took
building
them
was
all
off
out and
its
saved them.
foundation, but those windows,
Yeah.
I was like amazed by that.
Well, it's balloon construction.
Okay, yeah, no, just, I guess, but just to follow up on that, and I understand how the rule works, but, so it sounds like it was just a matter of cost. And the reason I'm asking is, we all know now, we're lowering the elevation of the beach. You know, now we've got, the building there. We get water in that building, we're going to have whatever, damaged floors, canceled events, whatever happens. So there's, seems to me that there's some additional risk to the building. So do you have, and you can, I guess that's debatable, but what would the cost have been to make the building compliant with our current code, the incremental cost? Did we actually analyze that?
No, we didn't. And the reason we didn't, or one of the reasons is, first of all, when we lower the sand, et cetera, we're expecting that the water's going to flow under the building, and it'll have a lot more room to do so, number one. So we think the building will be in better shape than it currently is. But two, we looked at a whole bunch of these kind of scenarios. We didn't get down to the analysis in terms of what was the actual numbers, because it started leading towards the conversation of maybe we should knock this building down and just build a new building. What would it cost to do a new building at the new regulations and that sort of thing? I think there was a strong feeling in the group that by doing a hodgepodge, and I say that loosely, we might as well rebuild the whole building if we're going to do it and go down that, because the costs are extreme to start taking a 15-year-old building and changing one little thing here and one little thing there. It quickly got out of control, the costs.
Okay, so you had some kind of idea or a ballpark estimate that this would increase the cost substantially.
Yes, we did.
And then that would put you into the kind of rebuild territory versus repair territory.
We might as well rebuild a whole new building if we're going to go down that path.
Understand. Thank you. Mr. Walsh?
Yeah, the cost on hurricane windows, I mean, Ms. Charlton, you've done it, your beach house, is astronomical. And just the wall that faces the water there, that is going to be like $300,000 just for that.
Probably
Now,
more.
Probably more. Probably more. Could be $500,000 for that nice option. That would terribly eat into our insurance that we got if there was a storm by that amount of money. It'd be better just to have regular windows. I mean, I presume there's a risk management decision that the town makes. I don't know what that is, that if there's going to be a hurricane or winds that fast, that events are canceled. I presume most people don't want to have an event during a weather storm during that. But I would rather just replace regular windows, use the insurance money, which is limited. It doesn't cover everything. So limiting it, I mean, but put a big chunk towards replacing hurricane windows, I think, I would rather stick with the regular windows to the extent we can.
I hear you. Just wanted to be clear on that. So, and to be honest, I didn't even think about the windows. I was more thinking about the elevation. And, I mean, any idea what an extra foot of elevation would have cost? Is that like $1 million, millions? Any idea?
Yeah, from the discussion, my memory of the discussions that we had way back when, it's more than $1 million just to raise it a foot, because we're trying. It's not like you can get under with like little lifts. You got to raise the whole thing. You have to raise, and again, the locker room is not being raised. We have no plans on touching that. So now I've got to tie everything in, and I'm changing the roof line. The roof line has to be changed. So doing all the. People think just raise a building. Well, that's a big deal, just raise a building by a foot. because everything has to change.
Right,
And
okay.
it's very expensive.
Yeah, I guess the only thing to be cognizant of is if, for whatever reason, that, whatever, $600,000 or $700,000 cushion we have is not adequate, and we got pushed into that scenario, that would be what we would be facing. Okay.
Yes.
Mr. Curley?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm clear on that point. So if we are mid-project and we eat into this $600,000 or $700,000, and it looks like we are $1 over the 50/50 rule, does the building not get a CO? Do we have to make it compliant before we're CO? I mean, effectively, we would have to keep spending money, correct?
That's correct.
Or you might see all of us out there doing the work ourselves.
Understood.
But we would have other conversations with FEMA at that time as well. I mean, to try to negotiate as best we can to stay under that 50/50 rule. Because there is a level of discretion that FEMA has on applying that rule.
Yeah, and my concern is around the estimates and the quality of the estimates. And frankly, I think a contingency that's less than 10% for this level of detail in the estimate is rare. Typically, we're seeing 20% or more contingency until we get to DD, and we're well in advance of that. So to see a contingency of less than 10 and $600,000 on a $3 million number, that's 20%. So in my opinion, all of these numbers have to be virtually on point to avoid a problem. So to me, I am very concerned about the 50/50 rule.
Mr. Walsh?
It's when we were talking about the 50/50 rule that I thought of this, because I thought about it before when I heard how FEMA can enforce. So, First Selectwoman Kupchak, when you mentioned the can of worms that could happen following a retrograde, where FEMA comes into your town as you're trying to reapply to get back up to grade, they can look, you said a can of worms, because they can start looking at building permits and zoning and whatever. And I think one of the areas they would look at would be the application of the 50/50 rule. Because I think FEMA thinks people cheat on that all the time. Because I know in town hall, I've watched those arguments happen at the table of people who want to make an addition onto their house, add a dormer, add kitchens that cost a lot of money, do whatever. And it is a fight to the dollar on what they can spend. And I think that the fight that FEMA would have is they seem to, it's their way or the highway. They're going to say, no, we think 50% was X, and we think that you spent too much. There's another house that doesn't comply. Let's go to the next file, and let's see what the work was done. And, you know, it's going to go on. And is that one of the can of worms, one of the worms you were talking about in that can? Yeah, because that's what I would be terrified of. Because I think there's a tendency for, I've worked with clients on this, I think there's a tendency for builders to write up estimates, you know, rough estimates, maybe too rough. And, you know, I think when people put a spotlight on something like this, it can expose hundreds of building permits that would further complicate the process, or potentially could.
Thank you. Can I follow up on that, Mr. Walsh? So maybe this is for Mr. Wendt. Don't we, I mean, this process that FEMA would go through, how does that differ from what they do anyway, every 5 years for us? Because I'm completely ignorant on this, but I think they do something semi-annually, and then they do other things periodically. But I thought every 5 years we got some sort of more exhaustive review. So can you explain that?
I can. It is true that there's an annual certification process under CRS that is less rigorous than the 5-year review, or it's a more extensive review. Having said that, the possibility exists. It is a constant, I don't want to say battle, challenge to make sure that the estimates that we receive are legit, and we work very closely with the building department, because their fees for building permit are based on the value of the work to be done. So it's a very collaborative process. And FEMA is concerned more that we maintain consistency in the way we apply that, and so that we're not looking at it from one perspective for this permit and a different perspective for the other permits. So while I am confident that our permit process would pass scrutiny, we are not in the best light with FEMA at present for obvious reasons. So yes, is it a possibility that in years past it was more of a cursory review relying on our good standing that we've had for so many years? Is it possible that it's going to be more of a white glove inspection to see if there's any dust on our shelves? Hard to say, but yes, there could be consequences for work that folks have done unauthorized, for example, that we would have to then rectify before we could get back into the CRS program. So while I'm confident in our permit process, you know, we are dealing with an agency that can be as strict
Unreasonable?
Well, I wasn't going to use that word, but yes.
Rigorous, okay, but
we're not in the best light with FEMA at
well,
present.
and you sort of answered my question, but I'm not sure you completely did, so let me restate it. This 5-year process, I mean, we described this dire circumstance. If we go into retrograde and then we go beyond that and then they come in and go over everything with a fine-tooth comb, is that a different process than the process that the town is subjected to every 5 years?
That is going to be entirely up to FEMA.
Right. I understand subjectively they could use a white glove or they could do cursory, but in essence, is that a different scope of work that they do, or is that the same process we're subjected to every 5 years?
It's similar. I think when we reapply, there's going to be more of an on-site presence where they will do their own inspection, drive around in how it happened when we initially entered the CRS program. They said, okay, we've been here for a couple of days. Here's a list of properties that we want you to pull all the docs for, and then we're going to go through those. And we did. So a little bit different. On the 5-year analysis, they look at all of the permits. They don't do as much of an in-person. They do what FEMA likes to politely call a community assistance visit. But it's similar. Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other follow-up questions on this 50% issue? Okay. Other questions? Ms. Marmion.
Thanks. I just wanted to go back to what Mr. Curley had been talking about in terms of the contingency and is it enough? And, you know, it's a pretty narrow margin there. And I'm wondering if there's been any consideration by the town in terms of having a building committee that can really keep their eye on the ball with people on that committee with levels of expertise that can help really manage part of this process.
There has been some discussions about a building committee. We think that the administration believes that we're fixing a building. It's like fixing a bridge. We want to fix a building. And to bring in a building committee, I have much more confidence in the people that we've selected as a construction manager and the manager of the remediation efforts. I think they're expert. I think they know what they're doing. And we also have Eli here from engineering. He's going to be the in-house construction person project manager who's going to run it for us. And I'll be very involved, so I don't really see a lot of extra value that a building committee would provide.
Yeah, I just want to follow up. I mean, if there was a building committee, I think it should be not what we have seen in this community before, where we get lay people coming off different bodies who want to get their name on a bronze plaque and do the work that's needed, but do not have, yeah, hey, that's an personal annoyance of me, John, paying $5,000 for a bronze plaque. I have a problem with it, and there's been some buildings where we paid for it 2 times because somebody's initials weren't on it. So anyway, I guess this property is so sensitive with the contamination, with all the specifics of a not normal construction project, as we heard earlier from our experts who presented tonight, that if it was, it would have to be a highly professional, like people with specific knowledge on, toxic
Coastal
waste
engineering.
cleanup, coastal engineering, or it might just be the perfect situation to use professionals. It's just at that level. So, I mean, I know you're still thinking about it, but I have no problem if it was all professionals as opposed to lay people.
I mean, the only thought process was, obviously, I think professionals are the way to go in these avenues, but sometimes you might want to establish a small committee because you may be eligible for some kind of something if you have one, similar to the Arts Commission that the RTM just established, that actually allows the town to apply for specific grants because you have one. So there's kind of like things sometimes. So that's what we're looking at. I personally think that the team in place are sufficient to ensure, and you're right, it's complicated. It's very complicated. And it's not a new build, it's just a repair.
Mr. Curley?
Thank you. And Mr. Walsh, I agree with you. I think if the town is to consider a building committee, it's got to be made up of the right people. This town has had building committees over the years, and we've had some projects that have not been run well, and we've had some projects that have been run well. I think the makeup of that building committee is important. Having served on one for 3 years and having my name on a bronze plaque, I can say with firsthand that when you have the right people on a committee, it can be a long process for these projects to occur. And frankly, you've got a lot of resources available in our town with people who want to volunteer, who do have the right expertise. And I will say that when we worked on the Smith-Richardson Clubhouse, it was a 3-year project. It was a full year of work before we even asked for money. That was meeting twice a month, every 2 weeks for pretty much a year before we asked for any money. And frankly, we had engineers on there, we had architects, we had construction managers, we had financial people, and we worked well together. And frankly, each of the members contributed at different points in the process. And frankly, the other benefit of the committee, if it's made up of the right people, is it does take pressure off your own staff. Because Mr. Bremer and Eli, I imagine that you guys are putting way more hours into this than you would want to. So I do think there's a benefit to it, but I also think that there would have been a benefit to having a building committee with the caveat that it's the right people 2 years ago. Because I think they could have been doing a lot of the work that has been presented tonight, and I think it may have come before us sooner. So that's my comment.
No, agreed, but 2 years ago, we were right in the middle of a global pandemic, so.
Understood, but we also, the building, the Smith-Richardson project was completed, started before COVID and completed during COVID and completed on time and under budget.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. He wants a, I think he gets a second bronze flag. All right, I guess the only other point I'd raise, and I couldn't agree more with Mr. Walsh, Mr. Curley, yeah, you'd need the right people. But I think the other thing, the other benefit, in addition to what Mr. Curley mentioned, is that it's transparency to the public. You know, it's a body that holds public meetings. The decisions are out there, the discussions are out there, and I think that has value, especially for a project like this. And look, you may be right, and maybe this thing goes exactly according to plan, but as you've conceded, you know, doing this kind of project fixing a foundation, taking out toxic fill on a building, on a beach is, I heard the word unique. So things can happen, and I fully expect things will happen. And so, that is the other benefit. And I might not say that if this wasn't the third go-around, but my opinion would be, if the right people were available, I think it could be a real benefit. So that's my 2 cents for whatever it's worth. Mr. Walsh?
Do we still have a town facilities commission? Is there anybody on that still? Or I knew a lot of people were resigning, so I don't even know
No.
if it's still a functional body.
No.
Okay, because in the past, that would have been a perfect body to kind of have done it.
Mr. DeWitt?
So I'm going to be that guy and say the last building committee that ran a very difficult Penfield Pavilion rebuild and move and everything like that. There were a lot of issues there, right? I feel much more comfortable with the management company that we're talking about here, and an administration person looking over this, to be honest with you. The transparency could come through Mr. Bremer with updates and that kind of stuff. But I got to tell you, I'm going to vote on this for a third time tonight. 3 times, man. And so is Mary and I had the 3-time. Did you vote on it 3 times too? 3 of us. Did you really? Oh, when you were on the. No, yeah.
Just to be clear, I don't think anyone's suggesting that if we had a building committee, we would not have a professional construction manager. I don't think anyone's saying that
I just don't
at
know
all.
what the value of I don't know what a building committee brings there. I mean, all kidding aside about Smith Richardson, a perfect project for a building committee and dedicated people who spends a lot of time on there. But man, when we're talking about remediating bad fill and all these complications, I don't know what value that body would really bring.
I mean, we have the special projects building committee that deals with 3 million and under projects. So who knows? I mean, they may be able to have take a
I mean,
look.
again, I
handle
think it's all about
roofs.
getting the right expertise, though. I
And
would
they
agree.
are, those
Yeah.
people on there are, fairly technical people. It's not just people who love the school or things like that nature. They have technical experience. So it may be something, that's something we're looking at.
Mr. Mottola, did you have a comment?
Everyone's made very cogent comments. I would just ask that, and through the chair, that this is on our agenda every 4 months, just to get an update from Mr. Bremer. I think that would, quarterly, whatever you want to do. Just, that'll get some of the transparency
Quarterly's fine.
that I think the public wants and deserves, and so I would just recommend that.
No, I appreciate
Thank
that,
you.
John, and I totally understand that. I mean, our community's been through a lot. It's frustrating, and it's sad. It is. It's sad that we're, all elected officials having to take amazing amounts of surplus that our taxpayers paid and to spend it to fix things that shouldn't have happened. But, it's our responsibility too, right, to fix things that are, to do the right thing. And so it's not an easy thing, and we will, I think it's a smart idea to ask for updates. We have nothing to hide here. We're just trying to clean up a mess and move the community forward. But I appreciate your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Mottola. Any follow-up on building committee, et cetera? Okay. Other questions? Yes, please.
There you are, Jared. I think I had some questions about, we talked about the uses of the funds, we talked about zoning issues, we talked about FEMA. One of the things I wanted to spend some time, and I think the board wants to spend some time on, is the sources of funding for this. So I believe you sent an updated schedule that we received today.
And just for the benefit of the public, this is a document that's in the posted backup, and I think it's entitled Supplemental Backup, and it's a schedule that says fill pile balances and proposed Penfield costs. Thank you. Go ahead.
So if I'm interpreting this schedule correctly, the town, through this body, I believe, has set aside $21.7 million in the aggregate, used $5.5 million of that so far, encumbered about $250,000. But ultimately, right now, we have the luxury, the town has the luxury of roughly $15.9 million available for projects like this. And if I am interpreting this correctly, the three pieces to the puzzle here, the $5 million for the remediation, $3.5 million for construction, and $3 million for the NOV compliance, that's 11.5. That would leave the town with roughly $4.4 million available for additional remediation, correct?
I agree with everything that you said. The 4.5 million roughly that would be left over could be what the Board of Finance and the other boards determine the best use of that money would be. I think the common wisdom is that it would be used for other remediation projects.
Mr. Crowley, can I just correspond? So just curious, Jared, where's the million from COVID on? From ARPA, I'm sorry, from ARPA.
Last line
got
item.
it. Sorry, I didn't see
Right,
it.
that's
Got
the
it.
last-
Thank you.
And
Sorry.
And just
Thank you.
to point out, the proposal that you have before you is for 10.5 million, and that's because of the million in ARPA that's already been approved.
Right, okay, but net, it's going to leave the town in this fill pile balance account effectively at 4.4.
Correct.
So, Mr. Bremer, I believe last meeting that you attended and gave us an update on the fill pile, you had talked about roughly $12 to $17 million of remaining remediation, excluding WPCA, but that did include Penfield. So I believe if we net out the Penfield activity, that would leave roughly $8 to $11 million of remaining remediation around the other sites. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that is correct.
Okay, so that does, if my math is correct, with roughly 8 to 11 million of remaining fill pile expenses, and again, that's a question, it's an estimate, that's fine, but 4.5 left to cover that, we do have a shortfall. So I guess my question is, would it be more appropriate to limit this funding request to just cover the remediation, the 5 million, not the full 11.5, leave 6.5 behind with the 4.4, and that would cover at least the low end of your estimate, and then to pay for the Penfield project, the 6.5 million would be bonded, and frankly provide. I do believe that the prior bonds that were issued for Penfield need to be accounted for, but those effectively are a sunk cost, right? So what we're really talking about is what's the incremental cost of keeping Penfield operating. I believe that it's reasonable to say 5 million for the remediation, 6.5 could be bonded, and the debt service for that 6.5 million would be serviced by the revenues or net revenues, net of expenses by the Penfield operations. Do you have any comment?
We have, we're fortunate enough to have this surplus that's been built up. We proposed it the way that we did. We considered doing bonding, as you probably saw in the original proposal. We chose not to do that because right now we have enough funding to do what we want to do related to these projects and not have to bond anything. As you know, and has been reported in the quarterly reports, we're running a surplus this year. So hopefully if that sticks, that we may have some additional funding that could be put toward future uses for the fill pile itself or whatever else may come up. But at this point, I would be inclined to use the funding that we have and only bond when we actually need to bond.
Mr. Carly, just real quick, Jared, what's the current surplus as of?
As of the last quarterly report, it was about $5 million.
Yeah, right. Okay, just wanted to double check. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And certainly, this is the administration's call, right? You guys make the decisions. We're just going to say if we agree or disagree, but that's fine. And my personal feeling is it would be better for the town not to bond to cover the fill pile expense. So now that means we're relying on that $5 million coming through, and then finding the balance to cover somewhere else. I personally feel like it would be more appropriate to. For those residents and taxpayers of town to know that if we're spending money on keeping Penfield running, that there's a cost associated with that in the form of debt service that Parks and Rec through the Penfield operations can cover. I think I understand that town money is fungible, but for me, geography is important. So I'll pause there.
And I want to clarify something that I said earlier about the bonding for Penfield that's outstanding right now. The total amount that was bonded over the life of Penfield was about $12 million. The remaining left to be paid off is about $8 million. So we're paying, on average, we're paying about $400,000 a year out to 2042 is when the last bond matures.
Thank you, Mr. Curley. Mr. Walsh?
Yeah, that's the 400,000. That's why I'd like the revenue to continue to at least, maybe not the full 400, because we do have expenses, as our chairwoman mentioned earlier, but at least something to come in. Craig, I'm glad you brought the whole subject up, and I understand your point, and it's not an illogical thought. It's just another way of thinking it. Personally, I'd like to use the money now. We seem to be on track, and I know we're only halfway through the year, so it's always a bad thing to say. I always feel like I'm going to jinx myself by saying this, that there could be another $5 million surplus, and I think this board has shown a willingness, including the RTM, who has sometimes had to get involved in that surplus and what we do with it, depending on whether it's revenue or expense sided, to put it away and towards some of this toxic things. And we'd also mentioned along the way, we had mentioned Penfield something needed to be being done, not just the remediation, but the building. So I would rather, especially in these times where the interest rates are a little higher, I would rather just use the money now, have the approximately $4.4 million, continue to put the surplus, anything that we end up with a year, put it towards further remediation. If we're lucky enough that we end the year in $5 million, that would be $9.4 million. Now we're starting to get up into a range where, oh my God, we might actually be able to pay for this with surpluses when for many years a number of us thought we were definitely going to be bonding some of this toxic cleanup. I was convinced of it based on the numbers we were originally presented. Completely convinced of it. But we got lucky with Mr. Jack not paying his tax bills, the estate paying it. I mean, that's $6 million. The way I look at that money is, hey, sometimes in a bad situation, you could put money towards, kids playing at a beach. You get some good things out of it. So I would rather just use the funds now and not have a third set of bonds on the Penfield Pavilion, which will take it out even further, and just be done with it now and try to work on whatever we need to do with the cleanup as those expenses come in over time. Thank you.
Madam Chairwoman, if you would mind, I just want to, I think Attorney Miller is still on, and if there isn't any questions for him, I'd like to ask him.
Who is?
Attorney Miller regarding the
Probably
soil.
not.
I thought
Okay,
there might be.
okay.
So Attorney Miller, if you could hear me. you're there. I
Come
know.
on, Brenda.
Okay, well, I'm going to let you go.
Message him. Okay, thank you. I want to, if I can just follow up, questions, clarifications, thoughts on Mr. Walsh's point. So first, the $5 million surplus we're running, and just to be clear, Mr. Schmidt, part of that has to go to fund balance, right? Because we did not budget. I think we put away 500,000, so that's not 5 million. If that 5 million materializes, like a couple million of that is, we would let go to fund balance in order to keep our percentage stable. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
that's correct.
All right, so we're
Did
not
we-
quite at 5. Might take us a couple years to get there,
Did
but
we get extra fund balance because of this change in the, what's it called, not gap or?
no.
No, there was no extra amount of money put in?
No, in fact, what happened, sort of the opposite. So what happened was we actually had a higher surplus in fiscal '22, which put our fund balance up to 11.75%. So if we want to keep that steady and not, I know there's always a desire for the rating agencies not to show that percentage going down. So that would actually mean that we have to have more fall to the bottom line. So it's not quite 5 million. It's maybe, I don't know, 2 million or so, whatever it is. But I guess my other question, and I understand the desire to use the money we have, but don't we at this point have some positive arbitrage there? I mean, the money that we have here is surplus, so we don't have to worry. This is not like bond proceeds where we have to worry about where we're investing it. You know, we heard that we're getting, I don't know, 4.5%, 5% on this money, and our cost of capital is, Kevin, what's our, I mean, I know the muni market is, rates are going down as I understand, so 3.5? Well, that's before, okay. Yeah, so just a thought. I'm not sure at this moment it's actually economically advantage to, might be economically more advantageous to bond, but I'll just throw that out there. And I guess my two other quick questions. One, and this gets to Mr. Curley's point about why don't we bond the construction. Is there any issue with us if we get to the point, let's say we don't have surplus, you know, things happen, whatever, in the future. We have the WPCA in front of us. Can we bond remediation? Is there any restriction on us doing so? Like we always seem to have delineated construction and remediation in these. And is there any reason that we can't bond remediation costs going forward?
I don't see any reason that you couldn't do it. I don't think it violates, I don't think it violates the board's policy. It's a, you know, the work that would be done would last for a long, long time. So I don't see any issue with bonding for remediation.
Okay. Should we make Mr. Staffstrom earn his money there in the little box?
I agree with Mr. Schmidt.
Okay, great.
John, you didn't earn your money yet. Keep talking, keep talking.
Don't go away, John. We haven't gotten to the resolution.
Oh, I'm sure.
Okay. And I guess then my other question, because, and I know we had some misunderstanding and back and forth and a lot of questions on this, and Mr. Schmidt, you just said, regarding this available balance of $4,371,000, so two things I want to know. One, if Penfield goes over $11.5 million, does the town have to come back to the boards to get approval if the project cost goes over $11.5 million? I guess what I'm asking is I want to make sure that we can't, you know, it can't go over by $4 million and we can just use this money in here. Like, does this resolution restrict the project cost on this to $11.5 million unless we get further action from the bodies? And maybe that's for Mr. Staffstrom.
I don't think the resolution restricts it, but during meetings, in talking about the $8.4 million, I have said that we would come to the boards to, for whatever use we plan to use that $8.4 million for.
Okay, so this, and maybe it's a question for Mr. Staffstrom. So we have this resolution here. So we're appropriating $10.5 million. We've already appropriated $1 million for ARPA. So if the project costs were to exceed this, does the town need to come back to the bodies for additional money?
It's not a simple answer, but I think the answer is probably yes in lots of different levels. When we looked at this and we looked at the resolutions to put this money aside, it was unclear to us, partly because your minutes were unclear. It's unclear to us whether the administration needed to come back to the boards to spend the money on the remediation. What was clear to us, based on the review of the minutes and what was said, especially at the RTM, is that the administration did need to come back to the boards for the construction piece of this. That was not contemplated at all when you originally put the surplus aside. At least that's what was reflected in the minutes. So our recommendation to the administration is, for purposes of clarity, that they come back, that these resolutions start at the Board of Selectmen, and that it go to the Board of Finance and all to the RTM for approval to spend this money. I think we would give the same advice if there were an overage on this project and that it needed to come back for more money.
Okay, thank you. And I know there was some confusion, and maybe our minutes didn't make it clear, and that's partly why I'm asking the question, because I think it should be clear to this board that if we vote on this resolution as is, and the project cost goes over the amount, I do want it to be very clear whether or not, the town, can we state for the record here that that the town would come back to the boards for an additional appropriation if the project costs were exceeded?
Absolutely. No matter what the original resolutions were to put the surplus aside and for what it was to be used for. And again, it's clear the original intent in putting both surpluses aside was to use that for remediation, not necessarily for construction, which is one of the reasons we're back here. But you could clearly state in the minutes that if the project costs go over $11.5 million, that the administration would have to come back to this board in particular, for approval of additional funding. That would be sort of the conditions you would put on the use of the surplus.
Okay, thank you. And is there anybody on this board that doesn't agree that that should be the case? Okay. I see everyone in agreement with that. So I would like the record to reflect that. And, again, part of the reason, again, that this has been confusing is we currently have this schedule before us, and the remaining amount, $4,371,000, all of that is sitting in a column called appropriated. And I think that's where the confusion has arisen, because appropriated to me means it's approved. So when I look at this schedule, what this tells me is we've established that Penfield would come back for the project costs, and I'm going back to something Mr. Schmidt said, because I think what you said is that for the $4.3 million, we'd come back to the boards to ask how to use that. And I don't think that's exactly true, because I know we're using this money to complete the 40 sites, et cetera. And that's going to be completed soon. And Mr. Bremer, you had said at our last meeting that was, $2 to $3 million of remaining expense for that. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So with that, and let's say it's $3 million. Let's say we're at the higher end of the range. So what I take then from this schedule is that there's, just based on the words on the page, there's an additional $1,371,000 over the $3 million that's appropriated, meaning it can be spent without a vote for that board. And that wasn't the intent as I knew it, because that would go toward the fill pile, which is, down the road. So I just want to make sure everybody's clear on that, and if that's what this board wants and intends. To me, I think, the Penfield money, we've designated what that is. If the project cost goes over, the administration will come back. That's good. We have this money here that's currently being used to complete these 40 sites that are in process, and they're going to get done quickly. That's good. There is then an additional amount above and beyond that, which, the way I read this, we've appropriated it for some unspecified remediation. And is the board comfortable with that? Or not? Mr. DeWitt?
My recollection is that the appropriated column was appropriated for fill pile remediation efforts, and that the administration did not need to come back to us and say, hey, I'm going to go fix X school or Y field or whatever. My interpretation also is that tonight the only reason we're having this discussion about where this money goes is because there are 2 line items on here that are not specifically about remediation. So in your scenario where we vote this through tonight as is, and there's another $3 million as per Mr. Bremer on the high side, that 1.371 is still available for fill pile remediation without any action from the Board of Finance. That's my recollection.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I only want to point out that I think the 8.4 did require the town to come back. The 8.4 is a new line item
That's the
here.
new- yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, so
you're
by
right, yeah.
taking this action, if we say all of this is appropriated, we are fully now appropriating the amount that we've put aside, including the entire 8.4, even though that entire 8.4 is not necessary for specified projects. And I just want this to be clear, because we went back and forth on about 6 emails trying to figure this out. The resolution got changed, and so is anybody else on the board uncomfortable with that? Or
I
is
guess
that
my statements, I'll amend my statement.
Yep.
Everything but that 8.4 million. So if the 8.4 million goes right to the 11.5 tonight, I think my statements still are accurate.
Okay, thank you. All right, I mean, I will say I'm not uncomfortable. I was uncomfortable with it when we were bonding $3 million, and, we were going to be appropriating, it wasn't $1,371,000, it was, $4,371,000, because to me, that's way too much money to be appropriating in advance on an unspecified project that we haven't heard about, and recognizing that we get updates from time to time. So, okay, so that is clear, but the intent of that extra money will be, assuming that these 40 sites come in at the estimated cost, that residual money will be available presumably for the aggregate fill pile, right? Okay. And Penfield, if you were to come back, but we'd have to vote on that.
That's
Right,
correct.
gotcha.
That's my understanding.
Okay. Everyone's good on that? Okay.
I'm good.
Okay, and we want to make sure our minutes are clear, because apparently we didn't read our minutes well enough, and it was unclear last time, so. Prue is. Talk to Sheila. Okay, thank you. Okay, are there any other questions relative to this schedule here on the funding sources? Okay. Are there any questions on the wording of the resolution? Mr. Mottola.
I know Brenda and Tom, you said that the resolution includes that $100,000, I guess, coastal engineering firm study that was discussed at the beginning of this meeting, but it's not mentioned in there. So I'm wondering if we should add this to the resolution.
Do you want to make a motion?
I can make a motion, and I have some language if you want to follow along with me. So if you have the resolution in front of you, if you go down to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, this the 8th whereas. You see, it says, whereas the total cost for the remediation and construction at Penfield Pavilion, as well as the cost to address the notices of violation, is $11,500,000. It currently says, in parentheses, the total costs. I would make a motion to put in parentheses the remediation and construction costs. And then add the very next paragraph, add this whereas paragraph. whereas the cost to fund the hiring of a coastal engineering firm to study and update the previous resiliency study pertaining to Penfield is $100,000, and together with the remediation and construction costs aggregate $11,600,000. And then if you just go down to two more whereases, we would change the $10,500,000 to $10,600,000. And then the very last paragraph, which begins $4 million related to remediation at Penfield Pavilion, $3,500,000 related to construction at Penfield Pavilion, $3 million related to work to address the notices of violation, and then I would add this, and $100,000 to fund the hiring of a coastal engineering firm to study and update the previous resiliency study pertaining to Penfield. Period.
Madam Chair, can I just, before there's a second, can I just ask a quick question of bond counsel?
Let's get a second, then we'll have,
okay.
does it, some,
I'll second
Mr.
that.
Curley seconds. Okay,
So-
Mr. Testani.
Yeah, there's two of us. Don't forget, there's the Board of Ed. one, too.
JT.
There you go. So, well, actually, a couple things. Number one, the 100,000, Tom, and clarify this for me, was that not included in the 11,500,000? Is that right?
It was.
So we don't have to add a separate 100,000, correct?
That's up to you. That's up to you. It's part of the contingency.
Okay.
I would also like to add, if you're going to add 100,000, I would think you should put in up to 100,000. Because if you say 100,000, the bill's going to come in at 100,000.
Okay. And then, John, if we change this, does it then have to go back to the Board of Selectmen, would be part of my question.
By John, you mean Attorney Sastrom?
I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yes, I'm-
Attorney Sastrom, forgive me for my
okay.
my
That's okay.
familiarity there.
I've been called a lot worse. I think that, I think under the interpretations we've given before, that this is not a bond resolution, because this is actually appropriation of monies that are already on hand from surplus from the general fund. But I think the answer is it probably does need to go back, because you're spending it for something. I'm confused, a little bit confused, because what I think I heard Mr. Bremer say is that this part of the project is already included. Because if it was an add-on to the project approved by the Board of Selectmen, it would need to go back to them. If what we're really just saying is we're gonna appropriate, this board, which is the appropriating authority for surplus, is gonna appropriate another 100,000 for part of the project that was already included in the scope, it probably does not need to go back to the Board of Selectmen.
Okay, thank you.
Very good,
Mr.
thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testani. Mr. Curley?
Yep, just to follow up on that point, and I think this is directed at Mr. Bremer. I understand the point that the 100,000 could be absorbed out of contingency. My concern is twofold. One, the contingency that's been identified in our previous discussions was less than 10%. So I already feel like it's thin for these type of estimates. Number two, if you add up the conceptual estimates, it actually comes to 11,626,285. So you're already, I understand rounding, but we're rounding down, so I feel like we're already handcuffing the project by $126,000, and now with the $100,000 that's got to come out of the contingency, we're over almost $250,000 handicapped before we even start. So my suggestion, and I'm not ready to make an amendment, but we're in discussion. My suggestion is, if we are going to take steps to clarify that this resolution include $100,000 or up to $100,000 for a study, we also take the time to increase the amount so that it would cover not just the $126,000 that was rounded down, but also the $100,000, so you're not handicapped.
So if I could just jump in to say that, I hear what you're saying, Craig, but at the same time, we're on a tight timeline. and having to send it back. And if you change the amount, my understanding is the language is not changing the amount. So John's adding the resiliency, which was already included in the estimate that we had asked for. But if you change the amount, then it's got to go back. And I think, listen, I think you can always add some additional money to it after the fact, but I would really like to get this done by the deadline so that letter can go to FEMA. And if the board chooses to, I don't even know if we would need the Board of Selectmen, but if the board chooses to transfer an additional 100,000 or whatever you want to do, because you think it's shortchanged, maybe you can do that without the other boards. I don't know. I know you have that authority to transfer. I just don't want to play around with this timeline. It's already been, stressful as it is.
Yeah, no, I respect that, but I do think that the reason we're meeting on the 13th is so that we would have time to go back to the other boards if necessary. And look,
We
I
have time if
appreciate
we want to
the,
make time. I mean, we've had less time than that to consider this, so. Mr. Walsh?
I have another mechanism. The concern is that it's not going to get funded, and to prevent it from having to go back to the Board of Selectmen, why can't this body make a motion to transfer, which is our right under the budget, to transfer out of this $5 million contingency? There's got to be an area we could take $100,000 right now, make a motion to put it on this board's calendar by an amendment right now, and I'll make the motion. And
Can we do that in a special meeting?
Oh, this is a special meeting, I forgot, yeah. We'd have to go to the next meeting. But I will tell you, if you want to take a sense of the body, to do it that way, to just give them the 100,000, if you're that, I understand, Mr. Curley, about the contingency, but we just take the $100,000 this year, the money will be available immediately to be able to get that study, and just take it and let the administration have a couple of days to figure out where in the $5 million surplus we seem to have.
Well, I mean, I don't think the $5 million surplus is actually not going to materialize until after year end, and we usually don't do anything with that until October. So, I mean.
But we can move in money anytime we want.
We can, but I mean.
Madam Chair, can I just clarify what I said? Because I think it might have got lost. What I said is, if you wanted to add the 100,000 here, because the resiliency study is already included in the project, it would not need to go back to the Board of Selectmen.
Oh.
If this was a new part of the project, it would have to go back to the board. But if all you're doing is adding the $100,000 from money that you have the right to appropriate, I think you can add the $100,000 now, and then this resolution, as a resolution for 10.6 million, can go on to the RTM for approval, and you'll have it all in one resolution, including the approval of the construction, which is why we had to sort of start this process to begin with.
Okay.
So I think that, I actually think that Mr. Motola's suggested amendment would not need for this to go back to the Board of Selectmen.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Mr. Curley, you had another?
just along those lines, so just to clarify for this point, the motion that's on the table, the whereas $100,000 for the study that Mr. Mottola mentioned stands, but the 10.5, does it become 10.6 or does it stay at? It stays at 10.5, I believe, if it was included or will be absorbed by the contingency.
I think the amendment was to add $100,000 to make sure there was enough money to do the resiliency study, but Mr. Mottola can clarify his own amendment.
Yeah, that was my intent, because it's not included in here. But now we're being told that
I think you should
it's the
include
part.
it.
Can I make a suggestion that we leave it at 10.5 million, and perhaps in one of the lines in the resolution itself, for example, 4 million related to remediation at Penfield Pavilion and resiliency study, to add it into some of the existing money that's in there, because and that's consistent with the proposal and what we know is underlying this, according to Tom Bremer.
I think, and we can do that. I think that the suggestion was made just to not shortcut the contingency even further, which is, maybe you've contemplated in a contingency, but I would agree with Mr. Curley. I think it's light, but if we want to put the language in to specify that 100,000 out of the 11.5 is appropriated for this study, I think that's good. The Flood and Erosion Control Board is happy. Everybody's good to go. We can do this study sooner rather than later, and we're good. But I'd also be amenable to making it 10.6. So I'm neutral, but I do agree. I like the idea of putting the language in.
Can I suggest that what you might do, if you want to do that, is just change the resolution to talk about 10.6, and then as Jared suggests, under the listing of the project at the bottom, I think Mr. Mottola had language to add a specific $100,000 line item. I don't know that we need to add another whereas clause, but I do think you could just amend this to increase it to 10.6 and then add Mr. Mottola's language under the 4 million, the 3,500, 3 million, just add the 100,000.
Okay.
So
Well, maybe
can I ask Attorney Bastrom, what you're suggesting, though, is changing the amount. So the 100,000 was built in the construction cost. The Board of Selectmen passed $10.5 million. $1 million comes out of ARPA, 11.5. If it changes to 10.6, it needs to go back again. $100,000?
I don't think it needs to go back again. I don't think it needs to go back again because, again, we're not, if this was bond proceeds, that would be different. This isn't bond proceeds. This is surplus that was already set aside by the board and that the Board of Finance has the authority to spend. So I think that this does not, for the 100,000, I don't think it needs to go back. That's my opinion.
Well, yeah, all right. Let me just ask.
Let's call it to a vote.
Yeah, why don't we just do into a sense of the body first, or you just want to put this to a vote? Because I think right now the amendment on the table is to increase it to 11.6, which we've been told does not have to go back to the Board of Selectmen. So do you want to just go to a vote? Okay, so all in favor of the amendment proposed by Mr. Mottola, please say aye.
I just want to make sure,
yep.
that Mr. Mottola's agreed with Mr. Staffs from the
So
administration.
leave out the whereas.
That it's up to $100,000.
Yeah, okay.
So I understand it's up to $100,000.
We could put up to 100,000 on the 10.5 too. I mean, we usually
The
don't say that.
suggestion is the whereas clause that I put in there, take it out, right?
Correct.
And then, change the amount to 10.6.
You'll change the first amount, you'll change the amount in the 7th or 8th whereas clause to 11.6.
Yep.
You'll change the last whereas to 10.6, and then under the list of projects, you'll add $100,000 to fund the hiring of a resiliency consultant to update the, you'll have to give me the language,
Yeah.
Mr. Mottola, but so it would be clear that that 100,000 is specifically
That's
there.
fine. Up to $100,000.
I mean, and I don't mean to be we could say up to 100, but why don't we say up to 100 on the 10.5? Do you really need that? Isn't it implicit that up to is the limitation when you put a dollar amount in here? It just seems odd to, I mean, should we say up to 10 million
It should be consistent across the board.
Yeah,
I believe it's up to or not.
If you're gonna make an appropriation, you have to make it up as an amount, so I think you
Yeah.
have to just leave it at the 100 and hope the administration's going to be, is
No
going to
more.
is going to get the best bids they can.
Right, okay.
So the language for that last little paragraph, and $100,000 to fund the hiring of a coastal engineering firm to study and update the previous resiliency study pertaining to Penfield, period.
Coastal engineering firm to update,
I'm sorry, I went too fast, I apologize.
$100,000 to fund the hiring of a coastal engineering firm to update
To study and update the previous resiliency study pertaining to Penfield.
Okay, yeah. Okay. All right, so why don't we move to a vote on this? All in favor of that amendment, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, it is unanimous, thank you. Okay, we do need time for public comment, and I want to give time for anybody to give any last thoughts, but before we do that, are there any other questions? So we went through the We went through the cost estimate, we went through the sources, we went through the resolution. Does anyone have any other questions on this matter?
If you're done with the construction manager, can he go home?
As long as no one else has any questions. No other questions.
I have no questions. I might have a comment after public comment. We'll come
Okay.
back to the body, though.
All right, good.
Okay.
Yep, sounds good. Thank you very much for being here. All right. Do you want to caucus? Okay, why don't you, yeah.
So I think it's important that we take public comment, but I think before we take a vote, it might make sense to caucus.
All right, so we'll move to public comment. First, is there anyone here in the room that would like to provide comment? Thank you, sir. Yep. Could you please state your name and address for the record? Thank you.
Oh, hi, and good evening. My name is Dick Mahusky. I live on Colonial Drive. And I actually sent this board 2 documents, which I will not repeat here, supporting this project. My only comments to you this evening are that, 1, I agree with all 10 whereases that appear in the motion before you. I believe curing the NOV and embarking on executing the consent order with DEEP and EPA is job 1. Please approve this project so Fairfield residents can continue to enjoy a fully compliant beach. Thank you.
Very much. Appreciate it. Anyone else here in the room? Okay. Do we have anyone on WebEx? Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry.
Jill Vergara, 271 Old Post Road. I'm also a member of the RTM. I hadn't intended to talk tonight. I did raise this issue at the Board of Selectmen meeting, and I know it came up here too as well. But I am really concerned about the 50-50 rule, especially in light of the new valuation. I think there are some discrepancies that weren't discussed tonight with the field card saying 7.1 million, the date of the building being changed from being built in 2011 versus 2015, which also changes some of the requirements. And then considering also that we have a very small amount of wiggle room between needing to lift, considering how much the 3 million. I'm just really concerned that we're going to have to ultimately lift this building. So, and it's going to add a tremendous amount of cost. I think that's a huge risk. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else here that would like to speak? Okay. Is there anyone on WebEx? Did anyone put a note in the chat that they would like to speak? Okay. Thank you very much. Do you want to make a motion?
So if public comment's concluded, can I make a motion that we break for caucus until, I don't know, 10 minutes?
Okay, so there's a suggestion that we break for 10 minutes, so why don't, that would be coming back at, say, 10:40. I'll second that. All in favor? Okay, it's unanimous. Okay, I think we are about ready to resume. Is the recording resumed? Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. So first, I want to sincerely thank the administration, Bismarck, and everyone who was here for all the information you provided in the questions. It was very informative. I do want to just give the opportunity before we take a final vote to turn it over to the board if anyone has any last comments they'd like to make. Mr. Walsh.
Okay. I plan on voting for this as amended by my esteemed colleague, Mr. Matola. And to me, in looking at this, which I've spent a lot of time looking at it, my mind never really changed, actually, because this is like the third time I personally looked at this. So right from the beginning, I will tell you that I did not think that this is a matter that should be relitigated on whether there should be a Penfield Pavilion or whether there shouldn't be a Penfield Pavilion, because I personally could never imagine this town not having the Penfield Pavilion. There are certain things that are part of our fabric as a town, and that is one of them. When I think of Fairfield, when I see pictures, when I see real estate brochures around town, the images that I see are the Penfield Pavilion and the Penfield Lighthouse, the gazebo, the community theater, Old Town Hall, Southport Harbor, Pequot Library. I cannot imagine the generations of Fairfielders that would come after this vote that would not have advantage of that beach. We have, we're lucky enough. We have 5 beaches. This is the jewel. This is why you can get a parking pass for just Penfield for free. But all the other ones you have to pay for if you want to go to the other 5 beaches. Because this is the jewel of the beaches that we have. And we are a beach community. We have to acknowledge that for the good or the bad, because it comes with certain expenses after storms and other things like that. But what I could never imagine as I was going through my deliberations on this is the thought that we, by our vote tonight, could possibly effectively bring a bunch of wreckers into Penfield, tear it down, a relatively new building, a beautiful building, and put it into 30-yard containers and haul it off to Wheelabrator in Bridgeport and set it on fire. While we already have, we talked about earlier tonight, 2 bonds that would still stay on our books for years to come and not get anything out of it, lose $400,000 of revenue, or approximately some version of that would at least help offset the cost of those bonds. It just doesn't make any sense to me. The toxic fill has to be cleaned up one way or another, so I was never really looking at that. How much that is, how much that'll cost, whether it'll go over the numbers that we have here, are all to be determined during the cleanup. That's, I think, Mr. Curley, that's a built-in cost, as you said. We have to do that. We might have to add money to pay for more, God forbid. But to me, the kind of de minimis amount not to have that beautiful building that we built 2 times and we'll be repairing hopefully a 3rd time, I would think it would be a sin to this community to do that. So for those reasons, and probably a number more that I don't want to waste everybody's time as the night's getting late, I am going to vote to approve it as is.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Mr. DeWitt?
Thank you. I agree with Mr. Walsh. I remember when we voted to take our 102-year-old building, I think it was, down and put up a new building. And for those that don't remember, it was a seasonal building. We got some revenue off of it, but it was just a summer place. We boarded it up in the winter, and it didn't get used. And we went into this process as a board of finance, and we said, we're spending a lot of money here, but we are going to keep this, as Mr. Walsh said, this jewel on Penfield Beach. And by the way, we're going to have a year-round venue that's going to generate funds, revenue. And that was one of the reasons that I originally, voted for it. I voted to reinstate it and bring it back to what it was, that new building, the second time, for basically the same reasons. Unfortunately, that process didn't go as smooth as it could have. And to add on to what Mr. Stark said, I really don't want to be paying for two 20-year bonds, I think $8 million left is paying that, and having having a hole in the ground at Penfield or a concession stand or whatever would be left there. So that's why I'm going to vote this forward. And I also want to really thank the administration, because I think your real role in this, aside from all the notes that say I want this or whatever, is the notice of violations. You focused on that. The notice of violations are the most important things here. Whether this turns into the old Penfield Pavilion or a hot dog stand or whatever it ends up being in the end of the day, the fact that we're sitting here voting tonight on a resolution that's going to clear these notice of violations that have been hanging over our heads for I don't know how many years. I think that's a testimony to the administration and your focus, and I think your focus was well placed on what you brought before us, before the Board of Selectmen and before us tonight. So thank you, and I'll be supporting the resolution as amended by Mr. Mottola as well.
Thank you, Mr. DeWitt. Anyone else? Ms. Marmion.
Thank you very much. I just want to thank my fellow board members for asking excellent questions and really helping clarify in my mind what I think about all of this. Also, to everybody who came out tonight and presented, thank you. I do have some concerns that remain following this meeting. One of the main things is we have estimates only, and I'm very concerned that the actual cost will be much higher, and that gets to the 50-50 rule, and I think that's something we really have to keep our eye on very closely, and it's a concern, frankly, that we might have to pivot midway, or maybe it'll be too late if we have to further elevate the building. That's one major concern. The second major concern is that lowering the beach elevation, it opens up a lot of concerns in terms of flooding, and I think the costs that are related to potential flooding, they may be astronomical. I know we can't control this. We have to do this work to be in compliance, but it is something that I think this town is going to face both at Penfield and at other beaches, but the resiliency part of this is huge. I wish that we had done this study before in the past rather than doing it kind of after the fact. That's a concern for me. With all that having been said, I do support this option, mainly because, as other board members have said, we've already bonded this project twice. It's a beautiful building. It's a beautiful resource for this town. It also drives revenue, which is a wonderful thing, and I want to see it preserved and hopefully see it to last for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Marmion. Mr. Testani.
Yeah, I just want to echo and agree with a lot of what Ms. Marmion just had to say, because I too have concerns. I think that's one of the reasons why we all as a board asked or suggested, whatever verbiage it is you want to use, that Mr. Bremer come in front of us quarterly to give us updates, give us detail on what's progressed, what the costs have been that were incurred. I think Mr. Mottola's amendment was a great one in terms of separating out the 100,000. I also think that we hadn't done it in the past, and in terms of having concerns, as much of a concern as I have, like you, I'm basing my decision, as Mr. DeWitt was saying, on the information we have at hand in front of us for tonight. And I, too, want to thank and compliment Brenda and Jared, Tom, everyone that has been involved in this. Ms. Charlton made reference at the very beginning of this meeting tonight that this brought out many emails that we all received. And in a way, it's a good reminder, as she alluded to, that a lot of Fairfield residents are engaged in their community, engaged in issues that are important to them, like Penfield Pavilion. I, as a native Fairfielder, have been part of Penfield Pavilion since, I was a child. I saw it renovated. I love the new complex, and I'm going to vote, as other board members have indicated tonight, for this option that the administration put forward. And I just want to say that in the communication process that I saw from the administration, I thought it was outstanding, not just to us as a board, but to all the residents that inquired of Ms. Kupchak and of other members of her administration as to what was progressing and how this was being handled. And I'll go back to Mr. DeWitt's focus on handling FEMA, and I also want to compliment her on improving what seemed to be a very contentious relationship at the beginning, which is not always easy in the world of negotiation, to figure out what the other person's batting point is, to use a negotiation term. So, but I too am going to support this as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testani. Mr. Mottola?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I am going to support this also. I'm not 100% comfortable supporting this. There's still some questions, but I think the alternative of not supporting this is much worse. I concur with what many of our members have said here tonight. We talk about the Penfield. It's been, I grew up in this town too, and I remember Penfield since I was a little kid. I remember when it was a private place, Sun Haven it was called. And, maybe I'm being a little too sentimental, but I think the building, you can't measure the costs of that building, what it brings to this town. I don't think I'm, way off course when I would say that it's probably a reason a lot of people move to this town, buy a house in Fairfield, they see it, and it's something that attracts people to our town. It's one of the many things that attracts people to our town. So I think it's important that we keep it. So I will be supporting this tonight, and I want to thank everybody. This was a great meeting, great questions by everybody, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mottola. Mr. Stark?
Yeah, and I'll be even briefer. I called on the administration publicly to be more transparent, and you did a really good job of that. And the timeline that you laid out from the notice of violation to now shows us how busy you were putting out fires and trying to get the right answer, definitive answer one way or the other from FEMA, and then to kind of put them before us and show us, the facts. Here's what you got to do. And I came to this meeting open-minded. I could have gone either way, but the quality of the discussion and the quality of the information provided, pushed it over the top, particularly that map, which showed that the elevation is 8 feet, and I'm going to guess it's probably lower than 8 feet in a few spots in there too, which eliminates a pretty major reason to vote against this. So, well done on the information provision side. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stark. Mr. Curley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I asked a lot of questions tonight, and I took a lot of notes as we went. I also was open-minded coming into here, and I want to thank that I think more than 100, the residents who sent over 100 emails in. Clearly, there were a lot of opinions out there, and I actually don't think this was a political issue. There were Republicans and Democrats who wanted to support this. There were Republicans and Democrats who felt strongly to oppose this. But I also want to acknowledge that, and I'm reading some of my notes, so I apologize, but I want to acknowledge that, we're unfortunately, I think FEMA was a little bit rough with us, and we've gotten ourselves into a no-win situation. And what I mean by that is, there's no good action to take, in my opinion, because, if we don't take action, the roughly 2,000 residents are going to lose their discount on the insurance and potentially, as Mr. Walsh pointed out, potentially some harsher consequences down the line. But likewise, I think if we do take action based on this plan, I think there's a lot of financial risk in front of us. The 50-50 discussion to me was really important. I spent a lot of time asking questions to the gentleman from Bismarck, and I understand that 2 of the 3 legs of this stool for this project won't go to that 50-50 number. But these are conceptual estimates at this stage. You know, let me pause for a second. I think it's really important to acknowledge that this administration did not, you inherited this problem, right? It was not on your watch, right? So both of these issues that are in front of us, whether it's the fill pile that's buried underneath this building or the cross beams and that are creating a problem. But what I really have struggled with as well is our final appeal was exhausted 21 months ago, and I recognize that you've been busy. But I would have hoped that in those 21 months that this board would have received more credible or reliable or detailed estimates. Conceptual estimates right now at this stage, 21 months later, feels like it's light. And going into this project, knowing that it's got less than a 10% contingency on these type of estimates, feels really, really light. So I recognize that we have a little bit of wiggle room, roughly $600,000 on this 50-50 calculation. But I'm really concerned that this project is going to get started, and we're going to get halfway through or 3/4 of the way through, and we're going to have a problem, and then the building's going to have to be raised and other things, which means we're going to be spending money to then backpedal. I think I would have been more comfortable if the plan was to actually raise the building and change the glass and make it fully compliant so the 50-50 rule wouldn't be an issue. And that would have been cheaper in the long run. I think it would have been easier for the town and the residents to get their arms around, this is what we're facing. But I think the route we've taken has left us at even more financial risk. So I'm concerned about that. I tried really hard to get to a yes tonight, but in good conscience, I can't support this plan. I do recognize that the fill pile has to get taken care of, and I would fully support that, but I'm a no on this tonight.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Curley. Do we get everybody? Mary? No? Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Curley. So I'll just give my comments quickly. I share the same concerns that other people have raised. First of all, on the flood mitigation, recognizing that there's a lot of arrows up there, I think I heard pretty clearly that lowering the beach elevation will make this area worse. I personally cannot understand why we did not do this flood study already and why the costs of that are not incorporated into this proposal that we have before us. I mean, if it was going to cost $1 million or $2 million more, I'm not sure that would have changed the equation. If it was going to cost many millions more, it might have. But I think to go forward without understanding the flood risks that are a consequence of this plan, that's hard for me. And I also agree on the 50-50 issue. So, you know, I recognize the board that there's majority support here. I happen to believe that, you know, process is important. And, you know, I would hope that as projects like this come before us, especially something as risky as this, third time around on this building, that we would have had all the pieces in front of us, and I don't think we do. And for that reason, I will vote no. I do hope that, I do want to acknowledge that the administration has expressed willingness to potentially have a building committee if a qualified one can be convened, and I really hope that's done. I think that benefits everyone, including the administration. I think transparency is important. We had a building committee before, and things didn't work out, but I don't think that means less oversight and less transparency is the solution. So I hope we go forward with that. And that's it. So why don't we go ahead and move forward to a vote so everybody can go home. All right. All in favor of the resolution entitled "A Resolution Appropriating," as amended, a resolution appropriating $10,600,000 for costs related to construction, remediation, and addressing the notice of violation at Penfield Pavilion, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, Ms. Marmion, Mr. Testani, Mr. Walsh, Ms. Leclerc, Mr. DeWitt, Mr. Stark, Mr. Mottola, no. Mr. Curley, Ms. Charlton. So the motion passes 7-2. Thank you again, everybody, and good night.